Hey guys, tonight we dive into one of colonial America's most sudsy and strange forgotten laws, a sleepy little footnote from Boston's past that, believe it or not, once made it illegal to bathe after sunset. That's right. Scrubbing your armpits under the moonlight? A crime. Washing your feet after dinner? Suspicious at best. Taking a midnight soak because your roommate's turnip soup exploded all over your only pair of breeches? Absolutely not. You probably won't survive this legally. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where, and when, you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk slowly through the dusky cobblestone streets of early 18th century Boston, the kind where lanterns are few, night air smells of chimney soot and cabbage, and every fourth building seems to be either a tavern or a sermon. The city's alive but muted, nocturnal in the quiet way a candlelit room holds its breath when someone's about to knock. And knock they do. Especially if you're caught splashing water into a washtub after the sun has gone down. You pass by a wooden post where a weather-worn parchment is tacked, an official ordinance from 1701, written in that frilly colonial cursive that somehow looks both holy and passive-aggressive. It reads something like this: "Let no man nor woman, nor child beyond reason, cleanse themselves with basin or bucket once the Lord's light hath faded." Rough translation? Don't bathe after sunset. At first glance, it sounds absurd, like something conjured up during a particularly boring town meeting after someone slipped on a damp floorboard and needed a scapegoat. But it wasn't a joke, not to the Puritans anyway. To them, cleanliness was next to godliness, but only if it happened on God's schedule. You continue past a modest home where an older woman shuts her shutters just as you walk by. You hear the slosh of water and the squeak of a wooden bucket, followed by the guilty thunk of a ladle being hidden. Illegal ladles, folks. This is where we're at. See, Boston in the early 1700s was a strange in-between place, still fiercely colonial, but growing quickly into something more complex. The streets were narrower, the smells stronger, the rules stricter. And among those rules, the ban on nighttime bathing stood out not because it was widely enforced, but because of what it said about people's fears, their routines, and their views of the body after dark. It wasn't just about hygiene, it was about temptation. After all, once your clothes come off, so might your morals. There's debate among historians, of course there is, about whether this ordinance was ever really enforced to the letter. Some believe it was mostly symbolic, another tool for the pious to control behavior through shame and community surveillance. Others argue there were indeed arrests and fines, particularly for those caught washing in public or within earshot of disapproving neighbors. One recorded case, allegedly from 1703, involved a man named Josiah who, after a long day hauling barrels, dared to rinse off in his courtyard under the moonlight. He claimed it was just his feet. The constable claimed it was an act of vanity bordering on moral rot. Josiah was fined and told to write a public apology. He later moved to Rhode Island, where apparently the soap laws were looser. You turn down a narrow lane, feet crunching against dry leaves and misplaced oyster shells, and pass a faded sign above a door, "Midnight Scrubbers," because this wasn't a law invented in isolation. It came from a tangled web of Puritan values, deeply suspicious of pleasure and leisure, especially when enjoyed out of sync with the sun. Daylight was for toil. Night was for prayer and silence. Bathing? That sat uncomfortably in between, something private, sensual, and entirely too prone to impropriety. And so, to keep temptation at bay, they made it illegal. It's worth remembering too that water wasn't always clean. Rivers were shared with livestock. Wells were shallow. Bathing didn't always mean refreshment. It could mean infection, scandal, or even whispers of witchcraft. Superstition ran deep, and the idea that spirits or demonic forces moved freely at night wasn't just a folktale. It was, to many, reason enough to avoid drawing water from a well after dark. Some claimed night bathers were trying to wash away sin, literal sin, under the cover of darkness. And if you were that eager to wash, What exactly were you washing off? Not everyone agreed, of course. There were dissenters, skeptics, and quiet bath rebels. But they were often drowned out, figuratively, not literally, by louder, stinkier neighbors determined to enforce godliness by the bucketful. The strangest part? People kind of accepted it. When every law is wrapped in scripture and surrounded by neighbors who will absolutely tattle on your soggy floorboards, resistance becomes a slippery slope. So life adapted. Daytime became bath time. Buckets were emptied before dusk. Children were scolded for dipping their toes into anything once the bell tower rang evening. And if you felt the unholy urge to rinse off after supper, you did so quickly, silently, and with the windows firmly closed. Even then, the occasional splash might bring the constable calling. You pass one now, an old wooden bench beside a stone wall where, according to legend, neighbors once sat with lanterns just to observe suspicious steam. The phrase makes you laugh, but there it is, etched lightly into the bench's edge, as if to say, "We saw what you did with that washcloth, Ezekiel." And so the night deepens, and you wander through a Boston built not just from timber and sermons, but from strange ordinances that told people when and how to be clean. Not just physically, but spiritually, socially, reputationally. You think about the people who lived here, who obeyed or defied, who snuck bowls of water under their beds just to feel briefly human after a long day. And you wonder how many people got caught? How many got away with it? How many went to sleep still dusty, simply because someone told them it was the godlier choice? The moon is high now, hanging like a watchful eye above the crooked rooftops. Somewhere, a bucket tips over. Somewhere, a rebellious sponge drips defiantly onto a wooden floor. And somewhere, in the sleepy corners of history, the forgotten bathing ban still lingers, absurd, sincere, and soaked with questions. You keep walking through the quiet evening streets, the cobblestones slightly uneven beneath your shoes, and the scent of chimney smoke curling through the air like the town exhaling after holding its breath all day. The lamps flicker gently, dim, sputtering halos of whale oil flame, and the buildings lean in as if listening. You pause beside a crumbling brick wall that bears the marks of a fire long extinguished. It once bordered a wash house, according to the murmured legend from the grocer's daughter you chatted with earlier. She said her grandmother remembered the place, not first-hand of course, but from stories passed down. That was where the witches rinsed their sins, she'd said, with the straightest face you've ever seen on a 9-year-old. You smile now. Because as strange as it seems, water, especially the act of washing, held a strangely charged reputation in colonial Boston. You wouldn't expect it. It's just water, right? But in a world that feared anything sensual, anything secretive, anything that couldn't be neatly folded into a sermon, the act of bathing took on a kind of mystical weight. Especially after sunset. Historians still argue whether the original fear was religious, medical, or just plain superstitious. Some point to Puritan writings that describe night as a time when moral vigilance wanteth, and claim that darkness itself was believed to invite corruption. Others argue it was more about control, preventing people from engaging in private rituals, potentially scandalous behavior, or the ever-present threat of unlicensed nakedness. And then there are the fringe historians, those who note that in many early modern cultures, water was viewed as a liminal substance, one that could blur boundaries between the physical and spiritual. If you were bathing in moonlight, you weren't just cleaning your body. You were, in a way, inviting mystery in. Which sounds poetic, until you're slapped with a curfew and told your bucket's a liability. You turn a corner and find yourself near one of the public fountains, long dried up but still encircled by the original stones. There's a faint echo here, a place where people once whispered while gathering water, exchanged gossip beneath bonnets and brimmed hats, and maybe, just maybe, dared to rinse off a dusty ankle if no one was looking. A scrap of carved stone remains beside the fountain's edge. It reads, "Clean hands, clean heart." There's no mention of what time those hands should be cleaned, but given the era, the implication feels obvious. The idea that water, particularly at night, could be morally suspect might sound silly to you now. But back then? It made sense. Darkness already carried so much fear. Disease, crime, witches, temptation. Night was a blanket draped over things society couldn't bear to watch. So bathing, a deeply personal, bodily act, became suspicious by association. Especially when done alone. Especially when done outside the predictable rhythm of daylight. You pass a little wooden structure, crooked and abandoned, once a wash house, maybe. The sign is long gone, but the shape of a doorway remains, and the floorboards creak under your feet as you step closer. You imagine what it might have been like, steam rising from metal tubs, hands scrubbing linen against boards, quiet laughter tucked under veils of water vapor. A space of relief, yes, but maybe also of rebellion. Because bathing wasn't just about hygiene. It was also about autonomy. In a society that controlled how you dressed, prayed, worked, married, and spoke, your body was one of the few things you could claim as your own. Washing it when you wanted, how you wanted, was, in its own quiet way, an act of defiance. And after dark? Even more so. There are stories, whispered through generations, of people, mostly women, who bathed in secret. Not because they were unclean, but because it felt like one of the few freedoms they had left. One tale, half fact and half fable, tells of a widow named Hester who would rise at midnight and pour rainwater over her hair beneath the apple tree behind her cottage. Neighbors swore her skin glowed in the moonlight. Others said she was courting the devil. The truth? She probably just liked to be clean. But in Puritan Boston, enjoying anything too much, especially your own body, was enough to draw suspicion. You continue your stroll, passing houses where shadows flutter behind heavy curtains. Somewhere, a dog barks once, then falls silent. The night deepens around you, wrapping the town in its soft, slightly judgmental cloak. You wonder how these rules were shared. More likely it was enforced through whispers. Through that uniquely human blend of fear and performance. You didn't bathe after dark not just because you feared punishment, but because you feared being seen doing it. And not just seen, but judged. The Puritan community in Boston had a knack for that, turning morality into performance art. Whether it was seating people in church by worthiness, publicly confessing small sins, or banning holiday celebrations, the message was clear: piety had to be seen to be believed. So imagine how bold it must have felt, in that context, to take a bath after the sun went down. Not just bold. Almost radical. Which raises a strange question. Who were the bathers after dusk? Who risked the scorn, the fines, the social exile? Was it the laborers, too exhausted to care? Was it the aching housewives with sore backs and no patience for daylight's schedule? Was it the rebels? The romantics? Or was it just people who didn't want to go to bed smelling like cabbage soup and candle wax? Whoever they were, their defiance didn't echo through history. No statues were built. No ballads sung. But you can still feel them, in the broken latches of backyard doors, in the faint traces of soapstone at the edge of old wells, in the occasional court record that refers, obliquely, to unsanctioned ablution. And, of course, in the quiet guilt passed down through generations, people taught to believe that too much comfort, too much care for one's own skin, was indulgent. You pass another alley, half lit by a crooked lantern. The bricks glisten faintly with dew, or perhaps something else. Maybe someone rinsed their hands here an hour ago, against the letter of a long-dead law. Or maybe it's just the night sweating through history. Either way, you feel it, that hush of forgotten rebellion. Not loud. Not proud. Just clean. And in this sleepy, sooty city built on contradictions and candlelight, that was sometimes all it took to be seen as dangerous. You step carefully around a pothole filled with stale rainwater as the street curves toward the harbor. The smell of fish lingers in the damp wood and rope bundles piled carelessly near shuttered stalls. Boston hasn't fully woken up yet, but the docks always feel half awake, watching you from the corners of your eye, as if the salt itself remembers. There's a small public notice board here, though the parchment scraps tacked to it are yellowed and curling at the corners. One edge flaps lazily in the wind, and you lean in to read the faded ink. It's a list of public ordinances, rules about firewood, hog keeping, and candle taxes. No mention of the bathing law, but you know it once lived among these rules, obscure, oddly specific, and enforced just enough to keep people paranoid. Still, to understand the bath ban, you need to understand what bathing even meant in colonial Boston. Spoiler, it wasn't exactly a spa day. You pass a cottage where the windows are open despite the chill. Inside, a woman beats a rug with a stick, sending dust dancing into the morning air. That, in some households, counted as cleaning, your body, your home, your reputation, all shaken out together. Bathing was a luxury. It wasn't expected, or even particularly admired. Most colonists didn't plunge themselves into a full bath unless they were ill, or wealthy, or very possibly French. The average Bostonian in the late 1600s and early 1700s relied on partial washing, hands, face, maybe feet, done with a cloth dipped in tepid water. Full immersion bathing? That was often reserved for emergencies, punishments, or spiritual preparation. Oh, and childbirth. That got you a hot bath, sometimes. If the weather and the midwife cooperated. Water itself was suspect. Not because people were superstitious about H2O, exactly, but because the sources were so inconsistent. Wells could run dry, rainwater could sour, and rivers were used for everything from laundry to livestock disposal. The Charles River may have had scenic charm, but it definitely wasn't fit for a moonlit soak. Instead, people turned to alternatives. Vinegar scrubs, dry brushing, ash and lard soap that smelled like every barnyard animal rolled into one bar. You rub it on with a woolen cloth or your own hand, then towel off quickly before the cold settled in. Your bathroom was usually the kitchen, or a curtained-off corner. Bathtubs were rare. Tin wash basins more common, but heavy, clunky, and a pain to heat water for unless you had a roaring fire and nowhere to be for several hours. Still, you manage to find a couple of them today, tucked in alleys and sheds. One leans against a faded wooden wall, its bottom rusting through. Another is flipped upside down beside a coal bin, possibly used more often as a stool than a basin. Imagine hauling buckets from a well, heating water over a fire, and lugging it to a basin for a full scrub. You'd think twice before doing that even once a week, let alone sneaking it after sunset, hoping no one caught you mid-suds. And even if you wanted to indulge, there was always someone to remind you of the risks. Some early medical thinkers believed that pores, once opened by hot water, left the body vulnerable. Evil humors could slip in. Chills could take hold. Spirits might find purchase in damp, exposed skin. It wasn't uncommon for parents to warn their children, "Don't bathe before bed, or the cold will kill you." It sounds dramatic, until you realize how easily someone could catch pneumonia in a drafty wooden house in February. There were no heated floors, no fluffy towels fresh from a dryer. Just a cracked basin, a damp rag, and a prayer you didn't trip over the dog on your way to dry off. You duck into a side street where a soap maker used to live. The shop is gone now, the sign faded to illegibility, but you can still smell something faint and sharp, old tallow or rendered fat lingering in the cracks of the stone. In those days, soap was homemade or bought from people like this, artisans who combined animal fat, ashes, herbs, and desperation into something that could sort of clean you, if you didn't mind smelling like smoked ham for a day and a half. Of course, if you were really rich, you could import soap from Europe, floral, perfumed, and outrageously expensive. Some of it was shaped like animals. One bar found in a merchant's inventory was sculpted to resemble a lion with a crown. It was never used. Because yes, even then, there were people who bought fancy soap just to display it. So, the practical picture of bathing back then wasn't steam rooms and silken robes. It was smelly soap, questionable water, and a strong likelihood of being cold and disappointed. But there was more to it than function. There was symbolism. Cleanliness and morality were often tied together, but not in the way we understand it today. Today, being clean is associated with health, neatness, maybe even success. But in Puritan Boston, being too clean could raise eyebrows. It could suggest vanity, indulgence, or idleness. After all, what decent person had time to bathe when there were prayers to say, bread to bake, and sin lurking on every corner? This tension created a bizarre culture of selective cleanliness. Hands and face, acceptable. A quick rinse after work, fine. But a full body cleanse after sundown? Questionable. Maybe even scandalous. So people bathed when they could. Quietly. With minimal fan. Still, the need to feel clean, truly clean, never quite disappeared. It flickered quietly under all the rules and sermons, under the woolen stockings and smoke-stained shawls. It whispered through cracked shutters and hovered near hearths when no one was watching. You can feel it here, still, echoing faintly in the rhythm of forgotten basins, in the way people wrap their routines around old fears, and in the slow acceptance that maybe, just maybe, some rules were made more to keep people in line than to keep them healthy. The next time you wash your face before bed, remember that there was once a time and place where that act alone could make you suspicious. Or, at the very least, late for church the next morning. You wander now into the heart of the old town square, your boots brushing over ground that's seen 1,000 small rebellions, none of them grand, all of them damp. This is where the people gathered, where proclamations were read aloud by candlelight, and where, on a crisp day in early 1701, the town clerk stood beside a barrel of salted fish and declared something truly unforgettable. A bathing curfew. Not a tax on soap, not a new regulation on how to clean your chimney, though both of those did happen, by the way, but a clear and earnest ban on bathing after sunset. You squint up at the iron pole that still stands near the center of the square. It used to hold notices, wanted posters, or sometimes the odd cabbage-flinging dissenter in stocks. But if you squint hard enough, you imagine it holding the infamous parchment, the 1701 ordinance written in tight colonial legalese, as though trying to hide its absurdity under enough vowels and semicolons. The wording, according to a surviving transcription, was classic Puritan pomp. Whereas acts of bodily washing undertaken in the hours after sundown have, by report and witness, led to idle behavior, spiritual neglect, and immodest exposure, it is hereby ordered that no citizen, child, or servant may engage in bathing, scrubbing, soaking, nor any related ablutions after the ringing of the evening bell, upon penalty to be determined by the magistrate. If that sounds like something dreamed up by an overzealous clergyman with a mildew problem, that's because it probably was. Historians still debate what precisely prompted the law's creation. Some point to a series of complaints lodged by elderly parishioners who believed the moral fabric of the town was slipping, right along with someone's soap-slicked backside in a garden barrel. Others argue it was tied to fire safety, since heating bathwater at night required open flame. It was seen as too risky when supervision waned and tipsy neighbors wandered home. And still others say it was simply another tool in the Puritan toolkit of behavioral control, yet one more means of hemming in temptation. And temptation, as always, was a slippery slope. You passed the old meeting house, squat and gray like a sermon carved from stone. It's where the ban would have been discussed, revised, voted on, perhaps after someone stood up and dramatically described the sight of a young man washing his arms by moonlight and declared it a harbinger of collective ruin. These were people who really didn't trust after-dinner cleanliness. Now imagine living under such a rule. You've spent the day tending chickens, churning butter, patching your child's breeches, and narrowly avoiding a chamber pot catastrophe. The sun dips behind the steeple. You're sticky, sore, and someone spilled molasses on your best apron. You want, just want, to rinse your arms, splash some water on your face, maybe run a cloth across your neck and pretend for 5 minutes that the 1700s don't smell like boiled cabbage and regret. But the bell has rung. And if your neighbor sees your shutter cracked or hears the telltale splash of water, you might get reported. Not necessarily because they hate you, but because not reporting might imply they condone after-hours scrubbing. And so, the bathing ban wasn't just enforced by constables. It was maintained by fear of being whispered about during Sunday service. You pause outside what was once the home of Magistrate Jonas Felch. A name that sounds like someone who absolutely would have an opinion about moral bathing windows. Felch was known for being fastidious, severe, and deeply suspicious of anything resembling joy. His diary, partially preserved in a local archive, includes notes like, "Saw Mary Alcott walking past her door at the 9th hour, face damp. Suspicious. Samuel's boy ran to the well after dusk. Possible bathing attempt. Warned father. Noticed warmth near Widow Barnes's kettle. Fire seemed unnecessary. Monitoring. Chilling stuff. And not because of the supposed crimes, but because of the sheer attention given to them. These weren't casual rules, they were watched. But there's something fascinating in how specific the law was. It didn't just say don't cause trouble or maintain modesty. It zeroed in on bathing. The ordinance went out of its way to define and delimit what counted, mentioning basins, buckets, and even limb-by-limb ablutions. Meaning yes, even washing just your feet after dinner was considered pushing the moral envelope. Which leads to a fun historical loophole. People started getting creative. You turn into a side alley where the laundry lines still hang between windows like sleepy spiderwebs. Here's where some of the cleverer citizens began preloading their wash routines. That meant heating water before sunset and hiding it under hay or blankets to keep it warm. Then, in the dead of night, they'd sneak into their kitchens, scrub down quickly, and pretend nothing happened. One court record describes a woman who confessed, not to bathing, but to standing near water with cloth in hand while thinking impure thoughts. She received a public admonishment, and was told to reflect on her watery temptations. But this all begs the question, how was anyone ever caught? Simple, noise and steam. Water makes sound. Splashing. Sloshing. The clatter of a tin basin tipped slightly too hard against the stone floor. And steam? That betrayed many a secret bather on cool nights, when an upstairs window fogged up just a little too noticeably. In one now legendary case, a cobbler named Eli from the North End was accused after a neighbor saw mist curling from beneath his door and a faint scent of lavender soap. Eli denied it, of course. Said he just spilled stew. The jury did not believe him. He was fined a small sum and warned that cleanliness ought not cost one's soul. You reach a bench in the square, wood worn smooth by time and gossip. Someone long ago carved a tiny wash basin into its side, whether as protest or parody, no one knows. But it remains, a tiny testament to the fact that even ridiculous laws leave marks. This was not a law that changed the course of a nation. It didn't start wars or end them. But it tells you something real about the people who lived here. About how fear can make us suspicious of the ordinary. How rules, once passed, gain power not just from enforcement, but from repetition. And how even something as personal as bathing could become a public performance, monitored and measured and moralized until the moment passed. And then forgotten. Almost. You lean back on the bench for a moment, letting the chill of the wood seep through your coat, and let your mind drift to the question no one ever quite answered. What exactly counted as bathing under the 1701 ordinance? Because of course people asked. People always ask. It's human nature. When told not to do something, the first thing you want to know is how close you can get to doing it without getting caught. Well, turns out, even something as simple as washing had legal gray areas. Take, for example, the case of rinsing. If you dunk your hands in a bucket after sundown, is that bathing? What if you're just removing flour or ink, or, let's be honest, some unidentifiable stain from your neighbor's questionable stew? There are records, yes, actual town meeting notes, where local leaders debated this. Apparently, rinsing hands in cold water was deemed acceptable, but only if done in the open and without excessive rubbing. A vigorous scrub? Too close to pleasure. A light rinse? Morally neutral. This, friends, is what they meant by spiritual nuance. You stroll along a stretch of homes once belonging to merchants, slightly grander, with tiny brass knockers and tiled stoops. These folks had a bit more leeway. They could afford indoor basins, servants to fetch water, even imported soap that didn't smell like goat regret. But even among the upper crust, the bathing ban applied. They just got sneakier about it. Some developed elaborate rituals to skirt the law. There was the cooling cloth method. You'd soak linen strips during the day and wrap them around your neck or wrists at night. Technically not bathing. Technically still a loophole. One magistrate reportedly sniffed at the practice, literally, and declared it marginally tolerable but bordering on sensual mischief. Sensual mischief. From a damp napkin. Then there was foot washing. Oh, the drama around foot washing. A beloved end-of-day habit for laborers, it became a sticking point in town meetings. Some argued it was medicinal. Others claimed it was temptation by way of tow. Eventually, the town agreed that foot washing could be permitted if done by someone else, usually a spouse or servant, and only in cases of visible grime. You could not, under any circumstances, wash your feet preemptively. That was considered indulgent. Also weird. You pass by a cellar door partly buried beneath a crumbling set of stairs. Someone scratched the word tub into the old wood. Was it protest graffiti? An act of aquatic solidarity? Or just a bored teenager with a stick and a point to make? Who knows? But it reminds you of another area of debate: children. What about the kids? Were they allowed to be washed after dark? And if so, by whom? Turns out yes, but only if it was an act of parental necessity. Meaning a child who fell in a mud puddle or vomited on himself could be cleaned, but only by a parent or approved caretaker. Older siblings were discouraged. Midwives, weirdly, were exempt. Which led to some odd loopholes, like the story of a family who hired their neighbor, a midwife with no children, to accidentally witness their 8-year-old fall into a strategically placed basin at dusk. She dutifully cleaned him and charged a modest fee, claiming it was instinctual. The town council was not amused. One fringe historical anecdote even mentions an elderly man who claimed to have invented the pre-sleep face steam. He would hold his head over a pot of boiled herbs, claiming it soothed his lungs. Everyone knew it was just an excuse to have warm water near his face after curfew. He called it night vaporing. The constable called it evasive conduct. There was also disagreement on whether bathing pets counted. Because yes, someone asked? A baker reportedly washed his dog, a filthy, beloved mutt named Cinnamon, after it rolled in horse droppings during an evening delivery. The town magistrate debated it for a full hour before deciding that beasts of burden and domestic creatures are not subject to the laws of modest ablution. Cinnamon got a bath. The baker got a warning. The ridiculous specificity of it all might make you laugh, but these debates were serious business at the time. They filled meeting minutes, fueled neighborly rivalries, and gave the clergy ample sermon material. Because when cleanliness becomes spiritual currency, even your washcloth can become controversial. You wander past the edge of the green, where several trees still stand, old, gnarled things that might have witnessed more nighttime rinses than the entire magistrate board ever suspected. Imagine how many people crept out here with a bucket and a guilty conscience, looking over their shoulder as they dabbed their forearms with rosewater. Or lye. Or leftover tea. Historians still argue whether this focus on definitions was rooted in legalism, or simply a reflection of human nature. Some scholars suggest it reveals a deeply Puritan obsession with boundaries, between clean and dirty, seen and unseen, public and private. Others argue it was just bureaucracy running wild in the absence of anything better to do. Either way, it's clear that Boston's citizens quickly became experts in verbal gymnastics. They could explain why a rinse wasn't a soak, why a herbal poultice wasn't a bath, and why dabbing behind the ears didn't count as vanity if done with a modest cloth. One surviving pamphlet from the period even includes a chart of approved cleansing practices, broken into categories: acceptable, dubious, and condemnable. No footnotes. Just vibes. As the wind picks up slightly, you imagine the sheer absurdity of it all. Dozens of townsfolk, huddled by firelight, passionately debating the ethics of sponge placement. People testifying in court about the direction of steam. A woman fined not for washing herself, but for failing to prevent her neighbor from drying off too lustfully. Yes, that happened. So, what counts as bathing? Depends who's watching. Depends how loud the bucket was. Depends whether you used the lavender soap or the plain one. Mostly it depended on whether you got caught. You wake early, if you can call this sleepy wandering waking, to the muffled clang of a bell tower marking the sunrise. It's soft but persistent, one of those colonial sounds that seeps into your bones and lets you know that Boston's Puritan order is clocking back in. And right on cue, the constables take to the streets. Here comes one now, broad hat, lantern, and a coat too stiff to sit comfortably in. He walks slowly, deliberately, tapping the end of his walking stick on the cobblestones like a man who has seen things. Or at least sniffed things. Things like lavender at midnight. Unsanctioned soap. Damp windows. You watch from a safe distance. Because tonight, we're talking about the enforcers. The men who patrolled Boston's crooked lanes and caught the lawbreakers mid-splash. The people whose job it was to detect post-curfew ablution, among other very serious colonial crimes such as using the wrong shoe buckle or selling cider without a license. And yes, before you ask, there really were people designated to stop you from bathing after dark. Though Bath Cop wasn't their official title, a tragedy, truly, the town constables carried that duty alongside others like candle checking, fire curfew enforcement, and occasionally chasing a loose pig through the market square. In 1701 Boston, the constables were unpaid volunteers, usually male landowners chosen through a combination of appointment and public grumbling. It wasn't a glamorous job. They weren't heroes. They weren't even particularly liked. But they had power. They could issue warnings, fines, and even detain you overnight in the local holding cellar, a place with a dirt floor and a healthy population of morally upright rats. You pass the old constable's post now, an unimpressive structure tucked between a bakehouse and what used to be a bookbinder's shop. The door sags. The sign is gone. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear the scratch of quill on parchment, as some poor soul logs a suspicious sluicing into the record. Bathing enforcement wasn't constant, but it was constables patrolled by lantern light after curfew, watching for telltale signs, the glow of hearth flames late into the night, steam curling from eaves, the rhythmic swish of water against basin wood. One notorious constable, Thomas Two-Tap Barrage, was known to knock twice on any door with suspected bath activity, then stand silently until someone cracked it open. He never raised his voice. He just sniffed, looked around dramatically, and said something like, "Odd hour for water, is it not?" You can imagine the awkward silences. The soap still warm on the windowsill. A towel shoved under a chair. Children frozen in place mid-toenail rinse. Barrage wasn't alone. Each constable kept a journal of suspected violations, coded with phrases like possible steam, vessel echo, and the extremely mysterious audible dripping. Some of these records survive today, quirky, almost poetic, little logs of suspicion and suds. One entry reads, April 4th, 1702, no moon. Faint warmth behind the shutters at 16 Milk Street. Citizen claimed stew. Smelled of elderflower. Possible soap infraction. Another, even better. October 11th, 1704, boy seen running damp through alley. Claimed rain. Sky was dry. Pursued but lost him near chicken cart. Wet prints ended. Historians still argue whether constables truly believed in the moral importance of Bath Patrol, or whether they simply followed orders with the exhausted pragmatism of men forced to regulate other people's elbow grease. Likely it was a bit of both. You pause near an old iron lamppost, one of the few still standing. Some believe this was where warnings were posted, a series of rotating signs about forbidden behaviors. On Saturday nights it might have read, "No ablutions past the 9th hour. Let not cleanliness be thy undoing." No one was flogged for washing, of course. But fines could be steep. Public shaming was common. One woman, Martha Greenfield, was sentenced to read Psalm 119 aloud in the square while holding a damp rag and a bar of soap tied to her wrist. She didn't seem to mind, reportedly. She read with great enthusiasm, then sold the soap to a curious teenager for 2 pence. That same teenager would be caught 5 years later dabbing his neck with rosewater under the stars. History has a wonderful sense of irony. As enforcement grew more farcical, people began fighting back, but gently. No pitchforks. Just pranks, shade, and quiet defiance. One household placed an empty tub in their window every evening just to mess with bearage. Another family trained their dog to bark whenever someone mentioned rinse. One clever baker placed steaming loaves near the window at all hours so that constables couldn't tell steam from sin. And every constable knew the universal lie. It's just soup. If someone knocked at your door and you were unlucky enough to be mid-rinse, you said it. Oh, the steam? That's soup. That's stew. That's my Greytans fish tonic. No one ever proved otherwise. And yet, despite all the patrolling, fines, and accusations, Boston never really became a cleaner or holier place for it. It just became more anxious. More inventive. People learned to scrub in secret, to hide buckets under floorboards, to dry off in shadows and hush each other mid-splash. Constables couldn't stop it, they could only chase it. And slowly, the seriousness began to slip. Some stopped enforcing the law altogether, preferring to focus on drunkards, theft, or street brawls. Others continued, but half-heartedly, jotting mild steam detected into their journals with a sigh. Even two-tap Barrage eventually retired, replaced by a younger man with less interest in soap and more in smuggling. It didn't happen in a single moment. There was no official repeal, no bell rung to announce that nighttime bathing was finally back in fashion. It just stopped being worth the trouble. And eventually, the town realized it had other things to worry about: fires, taxes, snowstorms, rebellious teenagers. And bathing after sunset? That slipped quietly into the background like an old superstition, never fully erased but certainly no longer enforced. Now, standing here in the soft morning fog, you can feel how thin that old law has become. Just a whisper in the stone. A joke on a bench. A smudge on a yellowing page. The constables no longer knock. The lanterns flicker with indifference. And if someone happens to wash their hands after supper? No one writes it down. You wander past the edge of the square where the houses grow smaller, and the air takes on a sharper bite, crisper and tinged with wood smoke and wet earth. Here in the outer lanes, people live closer to the edge of respectability, and, as it happens, a little farther from the reach of the town's most enthusiastic law enforcers. This is where you begin to understand the real heartbeat of the bathing ban. Not from the magistrates. Not from the constables with their notebooks and lanterns. But from the everyday folks. People who lived in cramped wooden homes with 6 people to a bed, children who tracked soot in from the street, and mothers who scrubbed turnips until their knuckles bled. These people didn't have time to debate theological nuances about when a person could wash. They were too busy surviving. And still, they obeyed. Or rather, they complied just enough. This is where the tension thickens, like week-old stew reheated over and over, between piety and practicality. Between Puritan ideals and human funk. Puritans, of course, are famous for being strict. The term puritanical exists for a reason. They were known for their obsessive work ethic, moral rigidity, and deep suspicion of anything fun. And bathing, somehow, walked a strange line between cleanliness and pleasure. You pass by a church with a crooked spire, its steps covered in moss, the bells silent now. From this pulpit, preachers once thundered warnings about vanity and flesh. Bathing, they claimed, encouraged immodesty, because you had to undress to do it, and undressing could lead to temptation. Especially at night, when everything felt looser, quieter, unobserved by the righteous light of day. There were sermons with titles like The Temptation of the Tub and The Perils of Midnight Cleansing. And yes, that second one is real. Ministers warned that the devil worked most efficiently after dark, and what better disguise than a washtub and a moment of solitude. One particularly fiery sermon compared nighttime bathing to opening a door and bidding Satan to rinse thy spirit with his filthy intentions. A little dramatic, maybe, but it landed. Parishioners, especially women, internalized these messages. Being clean was acceptable, but not too clean. Not too aware of your own body. That was pride. That was vanity. That was the first slippery step toward moral collapse, and next thing you knew, you were sipping cider behind the meeting house with a fiddler named Jeremiah. In a society where almost everything was communal, eating, sleeping, worshipping, even raising your neighbor's chickens, your body became the only truly private thing you had. But even that wasn't fully yours. It belonged to the church, to the community, to your reputation. So modesty governed not just how you dressed, but how, and when, you cleaned. Most people bathed, when they could, in pieces. A hand here. A face there. Maybe a full rinse on Sunday morning if the fire cooperated and no one was watching. But always quickly. Always discreetly. Never joyfully. You pass a laundry line drooping between two sagging houses, damp shirts and woolen drawers fluttering gently in the breeze. One of them bears a patch stitched in the shape of a small, bubbling kettle, likely a family mark, but perhaps also a quiet, cheeky nod to someone who washed when they shouldn't have. Not everyone was so compliant. There were whispers, always whispers, about the clean ones. A half-mythic group of women who refused to obey the ordinance. Who bathed in creeks under moonlight. Who rubbed rosemary oil into their skin after prayers. Who met secretly to trade soap recipes and scandalous stories about preachers who privately smelled like raw onions. They weren't witches. Not officially. But close enough to make people nervous. One tale tells of a woman named Susanna Hobb, who would leave a daisy on her neighbor's doorstep every time she broke the bathing curfew. At first, it was dismissed as a joke. But then the daisies started to appear in more places, on the steps of the church, at the magistrate's door, even tucked into the pages of hymnals. Susanna was eventually questioned. She claimed innocence. Said she liked flowers. Said she liked to be clean. The town let her go. But for months afterward, no one looked her in the eye during services. Historians still argue whether the clean ones were real or just a communal fantasy, born of longing, fear, and the inevitable human urge to mythologize mild disobedience. Regardless, they live on in local legend. Sometimes in pamphlets. Sometimes in song. And always in scent. Because the clean ones, it's said, could be recognized by their smell. Not bad, mind you, too good. Like lavender and sage. Like they'd known hot water more recently than was socially acceptable. And that, in Puritan Boston, was enough to raise suspicion. You stop by a stone wall near the edge of the commons where someone, at some forgotten moment, carved a row of tiny circles into the stone. A tub? A flower? A soap bubble? No one knows. But local children call it the scrubbing wall. They touch it for luck before exams. Which might be superstition. Or maybe just a lingering ripple from a time when washing meant rebellion. Because here's the truth no one wrote down, people miss being clean. Not just washed, but cleansed. Renewed. Refreshed. They miss the comfort of hot water. The scent of herbs. The soft sigh of steam rising in silence. They miss the privacy of it, the indulgence, the gentleness. But they couldn't say that out loud. So they shamed it instead. The rules, the sermons, the curfews, the suspicious looks, they were a way of pretending that people didn't have bodies. That they didn't itch, or ache, or stink after a long day hauling firewood. That discomfort was holiness. That suffering brought salvation. And that's why, even long after the law lost its bite, the habit of shaming stuck around. The too clean still drew side eyes. The herbal smelling still earned whispers. The woman who walked into church with glowing skin and braided hair still found herself alone at the end of the pew. Because bathing, in the end, wasn't just about hygiene. It was about autonomy, control, pleasure. And for a society terrified of those things, the bath became a battlefield. But even battlefields get quiet eventually. The daisies stop appearing. The sermons grow milder. The whispers fade. And in their place, just memories. A carved circle. A footnote in an old diary. A soap scent on the wind. And somewhere, someone's still humming a tune about the clean ones. This according to lore and a few dramatically vague journal entries, is where Boston's forbidden bathing community sometimes came to rinse away the day, or, depending on who you asked, their sins. The brook doesn't look like much now. It babbles softly, barely wider than a cartwheel in some spots, more mud than stream in others. But if you were desperate for a wash after sundown, and too far from town to be watched, this was paradise. Moonlight. Privacy. Enough flowing water to pretend you were in a poem instead of a settlement obsessed with sin management. It wasn't just the clean ones either. Plenty of ordinary folks, men, women, even older children, used the brook as a nighttime escape. Especially in the warmer months, when the air turned soupy and the scent of unwashed humanity lingered like a second skin. And so, a quiet tradition bloomed here. A tradition of looking over your shoulder. Of timing your wash to the position of the moon. Of drying off with the same towel used for everything from bread wrapping to baby swaddling. Not glamorous, but it was theirs. Historians have unearthed a handful of notes about this place. One letter sent from a visiting merchant to his brother in Philadelphia reads, "The people here are most curious. They forbid washing after dusk, and yet I've seen no fewer than 4 women at the creek past the 9th hour, giggling like ghosts. One offered me lavender soap. I dared not accept. You step closer to the brook and kneel beside it, your fingers skimming the surface. The water's cold but not unpleasant. You imagine someone once doing the same, kneeling here in their petticoat or breeches, clutching a lye-soaked rag and praying their knees didn't buckle with the chill. It was a private act, maybe even spiritual, but also risky. Because while Boston's constables rarely wandered this far out, there were always informants. Neighbors who would report a damp dress. A child who let slip that his mother had played in the creek by candlelight. A servant who described the sound of splashing like a pond full of frogs with purpose. And yet people came. They came for the water, yes, but also for the silence. The secrecy. The feeling of being unburdened, even if only for 5 minutes, in a world that rarely allowed softness. This wasn't protest in the traditional sense. No one was marching. No one held signs. But in a community where compliance was currency, quietly disobeying was its own form of rebellion. There are a few half-faded footpaths leading away from the brook, worn into the grass by centuries of cautious feet. One path curls toward the woods, a narrow ribbon flanked by ferns and low stone walls. Locals say it was called Soap Trail, though whether that's a folk name or a tongue-in-cheek moniker from a generation later, no one knows. According to one tale, a pair of sisters once carried buckets up and down this path every night for a week, determined to prove they could outbathe the ordinance. They were never caught, but they did become the subject of a mildly passive-aggressive sermon titled On the Arrogance of the Fresh-Faced. There were risks, of course. Not just social ones, but very real dangers. Wild animals. Twisted ankles. The possibility of being mistaken for a witch, or worse, a woman enjoying herself. More than once, someone fell ill after bathing outdoors and was promptly accused of inviting divine punishment. One man caught a chill after soaking his feet and spent the next week with a fever. His neighbor declared it proof that the brook was touched by sinful intentions. You look around at the trees. The way they sway gently, murmuring old secrets. You wonder how many people stood behind one of these trunks, drying off in the dark, hoping not to sneeze. There's an old stone near the bank that some say was used as a washing seat. Flat, smoothed by years of use. Someone carved a tiny flower into it, a daisy maybe. Or just a 5-petaled memory. It's barely noticeable now, worn down by moss and time. But it lingers. And so does the scent. Yes, that sounds ridiculous. But here's the thing. Many who've visited this spot swear they've caught the faintest whiff of soap on the breeze. Not strong. Not perfumed. Just the clean, whispery scent of something washed. Something remembered. Of course, the rational explanation is herbs. Wild mint. crushed sage. A particularly optimistic patch of chamomile. But it's more comforting to imagine the scent is history itself. Breathe out gently by the brook, in honor of those who dared to scrub in defiance. Because that's the beauty of this story. The band didn't hold because people were too afraid, it held because they had to live with each other. Because being caught was embarrassing, and shame traveled faster than news. But out here, among the reeds and twilight, people remembered they were more than rules. They were tired, dirty, human. And sometimes, being human meant finding a quiet corner of the world to wash your feet, rinse your face, and feel, just briefly, like your body belonged to you again. Some historians argue these illegal bathers were early feminists. Others say they were just exhausted. The truth is probably both. Or neither. Or something in between, 1,000 tiny motivations wrapped in soap bubbles and moonlight. You stand again, brushing dew from your knees, and look one last time at the brook. It flows on, indifferent to history, its current soft and steady. There's no plaque here. No statue. Just the rustle of leaves and the occasional bird call. But if you listen closely, you might hear the echo of laughter. Low. Tired. Joyful. Like someone washing away a day they were never meant to survive clean. You head back toward town along the meandering edge of Soap Trail, shoes softly crunching dried leaves, the brook's whisper now fading behind you. The quiet here is deeper than silence, like the ground is keeping secrets. Secrets wrapped in linen, soaked in lye, and wrung out behind barns by women who knew exactly what time the sun dipped low enough to break a rule. As you walk, the sky grows pink and pearly, the kind of dawn that would have once been perfect for acceptable bathing. That narrow slice of morning when the town, still drowsy and blanketed in mist, allowed a sanctioned splash before the day's moral weight kicked in. But this morning, your thoughts are heavier than the fog. You're thinking about the people who weren't just bending the rules, but rewriting them. Because while Puritan Boston was obsessed with spiritual cleanliness, it also couldn't shake the lingering thread of something older. Something much, much deeper. Folk knowledge. The old ways. You come to a bend in the path marked by a ring of mushrooms. Possibly just a fairy circle. Possibly just dinner. But once, circles like this were considered sacred. Signs. Portals. Places you didn't step unless you were ready to trade a secret for a favor. It's no stretch to imagine someone washing here. A woman, perhaps, who didn't just clean to get rid of soot or sweat, but as a ritual. As protection. As prayer. You've already met the clean ones. But there were others, even stranger in the eyes of Boston's rigid order. Folk healers. Midwives. Herb witches. Women who understood what plants could cleanse the body, and what oils could cleanse the mind. And they knew that timing mattered. Not just the time of day, but the phase of the moon, the direction of the wind, the mood of the water itself. These weren't bath times. They were ceremonies. Historians still argue whether these women were actual practitioners of European folk magic, or just herbalists with a flair for ritual. But regardless, they scared the living daylights out of Puritan leaders. Not because they were dangerous, but because they were independent. These were women who didn't wait for permission. They didn't need a minister to bless their soap. They didn't seek male approval to decide when or how to tend their bodies. And perhaps most scandalous of all, they sometimes passed their knowledge down. You reach a squat stone building at the edge of town. It was once a tannery, later a cooperage, now long abandoned. The roof is mostly caved in, but the lower floor holds. This, according to rumor, was one of their meeting places. Not every night. Not even often. But just enough to leave traces. They'd come with pails and cloths, jars of salves, sprigs of fragrant herbs tucked into the folds of their aprons. Here, behind shuttered windows, they'd share recipes for rinses, salves for cracked skin, methods for cleaning wounds and worries alike. One account, found scribbled in the margins of a midwife's journal, describes a moon bath, where water was left to sit in a silver basin overnight, then used at dawn to anoint the temples. It wasn't about hygiene. It was about clarity. Another page speaks of smoke bathing, a kind of fumigation where dried sage or mugwort was burned in a sealed room, and the bather stood in the rising tendrils, turning slowly, cleansing without water. No one taught this in church. No one approved it. And that made it all the more sacred. You poke around the building's remains, stepping lightly over a scatter of broken barrels. There's nothing left, really, just cracked stone and faded wood, but the stillness here feels intentional. As if the place knows it was used for more than casks. Folk bathing traditions were often quiet acts of resistance. Not loud. Not performative. But deeply personal. They were rooted in the body and the earth, passed down in whispered rhymes and tucked inside sachets of dried lavender and rue. The irony? While Boston's ministers were railing against sensuality and sin, these women were healing wounds, treating fevers, and yes, keeping people clean in ways that modern medicine wouldn't recognize for another 200 years. One account tells of a woman who boiled chamomile and rose petals to make a foot soak for a laborer with blistered heels. Another described rubbing mint and vinegar on a child's forehead to break a summer fever. These weren't sins. These were survival. Still, the line between healing and heresy was razor thin. If you practiced in daylight, you were helpful. If you did it by candlelight, suddenly you were suspicious. A healer in the sun. A witch in the moonlight. And once the bathing ban came down in 1701, any woman seen mixing herbs near dusk risked being accused of more than vanity. One infamous case, barely preserved in the court annals, tells of a woman named Eliza Crane. She was known for her cleansing teas and moon oil compresses. A midwife by trade, she also offered quiet advice to women dealing with things the town didn't like to name: grief, blood, desire. When a young woman she'd helped was later caught rinsing herself after dark, Eliza was blamed. Not fined. Not warned. Accused? It didn't go far. She was too well respected. The local constable had a wife she'd helped through childbirth. But still, the implication was clear: knowledge made you dangerous. Especially if it came with soap. Folk rituals around cleanliness weren't just practical, they were emotional. Grief baths. Fertility baths. Forget him scrubs made with lemon balm and salt. You step outside the ruin and let the morning light fall over you. The sun is climbing higher now, warm and unapologetic. The town behind you begins to hum again. Bakers stoking ovens, shutters swinging open, a boy hollering something about spilled ink. But here, just beyond their reach, you can almost hear the clink of a jar. The rustle of herbs in a cloth pouch. The gentle swish of hands moving water in the dark. And somewhere in the breeze, the ghost of a recipe murmurs. 1 part thyme. 1 part mint. Boil with care. Wash without fear. The sunlight now begins to stretch longer across the town's narrow lanes, painting the stones in soft gold. You make your way back toward Boston proper, weaving past early risers sweeping stoops and wagons rattling toward market. Everything smells faintly of damp wool and rising bread, and if you're very lucky, just a trace of something citrusy from someone ignoring the old rules entirely. Because by the early 18th century, things were shifting. The law banning bathing after sunset was still officially on the books, but public interest in enforcing it had begun to fade like cheap ink in a summer storm. Boston was changing. And with it, so too were its obsessions. That's not to say people suddenly embraced midnight soaks or lavender-scented rituals. No, this wasn't a revolution, it was more like a slow yawn. A sleepy stretching of social boundaries. The kind that happens when too many people break the same rule and realize no one's getting struck by lightning. You pass the old printer's shop, still bearing the faint ghost of painted lettering over the doorframe. In 1707, this is where a tiny broadside appeared with the headline: The Curious Ordinance on After-Dusk Cleansing, a review of Boston's wettest crime. The tone was satirical. Teasing even. It detailed the famous steamy door incident, and poked fun at the poor constable who reportedly slipped in a puddle while pursuing a suspected tub filler. It was a hit. Sold dozens of copies. Church leaders were not amused. This was Boston's first recorded mockery of the bathing ban. And it wasn't the last. Over the next decade, pamphlets began to appear with more frequency. parodying the law and those who enforced it. One notable favorite was called Soap and Shadows, a short play featuring a Puritan family secretly trying to wash their feet before bed while evading their neighbors' overzealous moral patrol. It featured lines like, "Hark! Dost thou hear the slosh? 'Tis sin in the basin, surely." Audiences howled. Preachers scowled. This slow cultural drift didn't come from rebellion, it came from exhaustion. After all, a city can only maintain so many ridiculous laws before the people grow weary of pretending. Especially when other towns along the coast had already moved on. Newport, for example, never bothered with a formal bathing curfew. People there still washed before bed and, remarkably, society didn't crumble. Salem tried to copy Boston's rule but dropped it within a year after an incident involving a minister and a tip chamber pot. Details remain mercifully vague. And further south, Philadelphia was already on its way to becoming the Enlightenment's darling child, more interested in clean streets and clean teeth than policing how many candle marks had passed since someone last rinsed their elbows. Boston was behind the times, and it was beginning to show. You pause near a set of stone steps leading down to what used to be a small wash house, a public place where women once gathered during the day to do laundry, swap recipes, and engage in what ministers often called idle conversation. After the ban, these houses were padlocked at dusk. But by the 1720s, enforcement was spotty. Records show one of the wash house caretakers began renting it out for secret evening rinses, charging an extra. His name? Elias Cooper. The man's not famous, but maybe he should be. Because Elias, like so many others, understood something important. There was profit in discretion. Capitalism, yes, even in Puritan Boston, did what piety couldn't. By the mid-18th century, a number of discreet evening laundries had appeared across the city. They operated under euphemisms like linen freshening services or post-supper domestic maintenance. No one called it bathing. But everyone knew. This also gave rise to what one diarist called quiet housework hours, a polite term for those late-night routines when women would clean themselves under the guise of tidying hearths or soaking cloths. The same copper basin used for scrubbing potatoes became a haven of self-care once the fire died down. And people started talking about it. Not loudly. Not on the pulpit. But in whispers, letters, and scribbled margins. One woman wrote to her sister in Connecticut. "I cannot lie. I washed after 9 last Sunday. The water was warm, the house was quiet, and for the first time in many days, I felt like my skin belonged to me again." That simple phrase, "my skin belonged to me," spoke volumes. Because this was more than clean hands and soap suds. This was about control. Privacy. Peace. Even as the town kept its rules, its people quietly rewrote them every night. You pass a row of newer homes now, Georgian, taller, proud with their orderly windows and perfectly straight chimneys. The kind of architecture that pretends rules don't apply to it. These were the homes of Boston's rising class, merchants, lawyers, landowners who had begun importing ideas and furniture from Europe. And yes, bathtubs. The clawfoot tub didn't yet exist, but metal soaking tubs were becoming more common among the wealthy. A few even imported porcelain basins, delicate, patterned, wildly impractical, and nearly sacred in their function. A merchant named Nathaniel Whitaker was known to take full plunges once a week, regardless of the hour. His maid once reportedly told a friend, "He bathes as if he's French." She meant it as an insult. But secretly, many admired him. He didn't hide it. He didn't sneak buckets through back doors. He bathed in the open. At night. And paid his fines with a smile. Of course, the church still grumbled. The town still warned. But slowly, the culture shifted. By 1740, there were fewer constables willing to write down steam-related violations. The fines went uncollected. The warnings sounded half-hearted. The law was still technically in place, but everyone knew. It was over. No dramatic repeal. No fiery speech. Just disuse. Like a song people stopped humming. And yet, the echoes remained. You reach the town hall now, rebuilt in the 1740s after fire damaged the original. Here, a single volume of public ordinances sits under glass in the lobby. Yellowed. Cracked. Almost unreadable. But if you squint, near the bottom of one brittle page you'll find it. No ablutions, scrubbing, nor acts of bodily immersion shall be undertaken past the tolling of the evening bell. And beneath it? A scrawled note, dated 1749, in someone's tired, inky hand. Let it be. None obey. None care. You drift from the hall, that brittle ordinance still flickering behind your eyes like a ghost of rules past. The cobblestone streets hum a little louder now, early carts rumbling, shutters creaking open, boots clomping with purpose. But there's still a strange stillness tucked beneath the bustle. A quiet knowing. Because even if the law was dead in practice, its shadow lingered in the corners. You follow your feet down toward the waterfront. Boston's harbor smells of brine, and the merchant ships had returned. Not just with molasses and tobacco, but with ideas. Specifically, French hygiene. You chuckle, because yes, it sounds dramatic. But let's be honest, no one rattled the Puritan worldview quite like the French. They wore colors. They danced. They perfumed things. And most unsettling of all, they bathed. Regularly. With pleasure. Historians still argue whether the spike in bathing interest around Boston's merchant circles came from necessity or vanity. But what's clear is that, by 1752, more households had copper tubs than ever before. Some imported. Some homemade. All inconveniently heavy and uncomfortably bold. Bathing became a statement. A soft rebellion whispered in lavender and rosewater. And the old guard didn't like it. You stopped near a small tavern along Fish Street. Nothing fancy. Just crooked shingles, a cracked sign, and the lingering scent of boiled rum. But this is where one of the strangest bathing-related altercations in Boston's colonial history occurred. The story goes like this. A French merchant named Monsieur Devereux was staying in the upper rooms, recently arrived from Marseille. He had wealth, charm, and scandalously, a standing tub delivered to his chamber. One evening, a servant reported seeing steam rise from the window. Another claimed to hear splashes, rhythmic and deliberate. It became talk of the town. Devereux didn't deny it. In fact, he leaned into it. He told anyone who would listen that he bathed nightly, sometimes twice. He offered unsolicited tips on oil blends. Claimed cleanliness increased business acumen. Said something about pores being portals to success. Predictably, the town erupted. One minister called him a moist disgrace. Another sermon titled Beware the Scented Man went into dramatic detail about foreign dangers lurking in the guise of cleanliness. But a funny thing happened. People liked him. They were curious. Devereux's business thrived. Locals began asking questions, quietly of course, about his routines. Did he use salts? What was that citrus oil called again? How did he heat water so evenly? And just like that, curiosity began to chip away at the last of Boston's nighttime bathing taboos. You pass a shop front with small panes of glass, rare, expensive, imported. A delicately lettered sign reads, H. Avery and Daughters, Fragrant Waters and Fine Linens. This place opened in 1755. It was Boston's first dedicated bath-related boutique. Not officially, of course. The sign didn't mention soap. But inside? Racks of herbs. Imported sponges. Tiny jars of lavender oil labeled for linens but understood by all. They even sold copper washbowls etched with tulips and birds, subtle enough to pass as decorative, deep enough to handle an illicit foot soak. One receipt from H. Avery's records a purchase of evening mint balm by a local clergyman's wife. She claimed it was for her husband's scalp. But several months later, the same balm was purchased by 3 other women in the congregation, and one local baker who insisted it soothed his wrists. You pause, imagining them all at home, doors locked, candles lit low. Each dipping fingers into a forbidden balm, dabbing temples, rinsing cheeks, maybe, just maybe, soaking their feet in a basin perched precariously by the fire. Was it rebellion? Maybe not in the fiery, flag-waving sense. But for these people, born into a world of fear-wrapped rules, A nightly rinse was as daring as it got. Of course, resistance also came with merchandising. A short-lived broadsheet launched in 1757, sold under the title Evening Splash. It was part advice column, part gossip rag, and part herbal. Church elders tried to ban it, but the press simply renamed it Domestic Remedies Weekly and continued with a wink. By now, you're reaching a narrow alley near the center of town where tenement houses were stacked tightly, windows barely elbow-width apart. In the cracks between these buildings, buckets were quietly filled. Cloths were wrung out. And smoke from stew often carried hints of rosemary, lemon peel, or eucalyptus, all conveniently misidentified as soup ingredients in town records. A constable once tried to confiscate a crate of imported French soaps, declaring them tools of vanity. The merchant, a grinning man with an ambiguous accent, pointed to the crate label, 4 dishes. He sold out by week's end. It was clever. And telling. Because the townspeople weren't just ignoring the old ordinance now, they were mocking it. Circumventing it with humor. Repurposing it until its edges wore smooth and its teeth fell out. By the early 1760s, Boston's bath culture had fully turned the corner. Public bathhouses appeared, first disguised as laundry halls or therapeutic centers, then bolder, with signs like, for rest, warmth, and hygienic ease. People talked about water temperature, about oils, about linen softness. They passed recipes. They argued over salt blends. They built bath closets into their homes, small, hidden nooks where they could wash at any hour without fear of judgment, or knocks on the door. And no one enforced the old rule anymore. Yet the ban itself remained quietly tucked in the city's books, as if too stubborn or too embarrassed to be struck out. Because some part of Boston still didn't want to admit it had been wrong. That it had spent decades warning its people that nighttime water would damn them, only to find that, in the end, it mostly just made them nicer to sit next to. You lean against a fence as the city stirs fully awake around you. The past and present hum in tandem. You think of Dave Airy with his soap monologues. Of Mrs. Avery's floral bowls. Of the sermons and the secrets, and the steady, quiet persistence of people who just wanted to feel clean when the day was done. And maybe, deep down, that's all this ever was. A sleepy city full of tired people trying to wash away the noise before bed. You slip through the thinning morning crowd, footsteps soft now as if not to disturb the dust of decades past. Somewhere nearby, a church bell rings, not for sin or supper, just time, moving forward as it always does, dragging stories like yours behind it. The story of Boston's nighttime bathing ban had drifted into farce, then into folklore. But for a few years, just as the law began to lose its fangs, something unexpected happened. Bathing didn't just become tolerated. It became fashionable. Enter the colonial spa craze. You chuckle as the phrase rolls through your mind like it's a modern wellness trend on parchment and ink. But it's true. For a short but curious window during the late 1760s and early 1770s, Boston, yes, modest, moralistic Boston, began flirting with the idea of leisure bathing. And not just any bathing. Mineral waters. Herbal soaks. Something imported, refined. French in name, British in origin, but repackaged with Puritan restraint. Welcome to the bizarre and brief age of therapeutic modesty. You reach a squat building near the edge of the market square, once a dry goods store, then briefly a public refreshment room. Today it's nothing more than boarded windows and cracked stone, but once, it was Boston's most talked about spa. They called it the Willow Room. Not a spa in the modern sense. No cucumber slices or flute music. But for the era, it was groundbreaking. 3 partitioned wooden chambers, each outfitted with a steaming bucket, a linen curtain, and a thin reed mat so you didn't have to stand barefoot on the floorboards. It promised discretion, warmth, and medicinal cleansing without undue exposure. It didn't last long. Historians still argue whether the Willow Room was shut down for moral complaints, or simply poor plumbing. But what's clear is this: the concept took root. Pamphlets began appearing touting the health benefits of warm water and restful rinsing. Doctors, yes, actual physicians, wrote essays suggesting that cleanliness could prevent disease, reduce melancholy, and soothe the nerves after domestic toil. You grin as you remember one pamphlet titled "The Hearth as a Temple: Cleanliness for the God-Fearing Woman." It featured illustrations of modest home bathing setups, complete with little captions like "a basin of virtue" and "soap for the weary spirit." These weren't jokes. These were sincere efforts to spiritualize the idea of relaxing into cleanliness. A way to make it all okay. Boston couldn't quite leap into luxury, so it wrapped self-care in sanctity instead. Some households began designating a quiet hour after supper, not officially for bathing, but for restoration. Everyone knew what it meant. You light a candle. You heat water. You wash, just enough. One woman, Abigail Winthrop, of no relation to the governor, became mildly famous in her circle for hosting evening wellness salons. Which, in Puritan terms, meant she had a clean copper basin, some rosemary oil, and the social boldness to invite friends over to use them. They never called it bathing. They called it tonic renewal. But everyone left glowing and a little damp. You pass the edge of Beacon Hill now, its shadows just beginning to recede as sunlight climbs the bricks. This was where the wealthier families lived, and it's here that the spa craze reached its peak. Imported tin tubs. Decorative bath towels from London. Lemon peels soaked in vinegar and used to dab elbows. It was luxurious, but still careful. Still clothed in just enough humility to pass as moral. And then came the newspapers. One anonymous editorial, published in the Boston Evening Post in 1771, reads, "There is virtue in warmth, and dignity in the act of washing away the burdens of the day. May our daughters never fear the basin, so long as it is used with modest hands and a grateful heart." Another offered recipes for evening water, a simple infusion of mint, salt, and sage meant for dabbing the temples or rinsing the feet. It concluded, charmingly, with, "Do not soak." That would be French. Still, the trend spread. Quietly. Cautiously. Wealthy families added cleansing corners to their homes, curtain nooks where a basin could be kept without scandal. Servants were instructed to warm water just before bed. Traveling salesmen began offering soaps with less floral scent and more words like sturdy, pious, and healthful on the label. And suddenly, the line between moral uprightness and well-washed toes began to blur. Even the churches relaxed, slightly. A sermon from 1772 titled "The Lord Also Rested, Thoughts on Domestic Wellness" declared that it is no sin to rinse the body, if the mind remains humble. A small win, but a win nonetheless. The moment was fragile. A balancing act. Boston wasn't ready to embrace luxury, but it had finally stopped flinching at warmth. People were no longer knocking on their neighbors' doors to report excessive dampness. The constables had, by now, fully retired their steam reports. But not everyone celebrated this shift. There remained a few holdouts, stern ministers, concerned neighbors, and one especially cranky magistrate who penned a series of anonymous warnings under the pen name "The Watcher of Warmth." He warned that evening water could weaken moral resolve. That rosemary encouraged unruly thoughts. That mint on the forehead was a gateway to vanity. Their letter began. "Sir, I write this while drying my ankles. You must cope." Even in Puritan Boston, the memes were alive. The spa craze wasn't widespread. It never reached the poorer neighborhoods, and it fizzled entirely by the time war crept into the city's bones. But for those few years, something had bloomed, quiet, fragrant, steam-kissed. A chapter where the people who had once feared a single drop of nighttime water now sought it out. Revered it. Bottled it. And though the Willow Room closed, others took its place in small ways. One family converted their cellar into a private bath nook, hidden behind stacked barrels and accessible only by candlelight. Another woman taught her daughters to make healing rinse teas and left a journal titled "The Water Hours," which survives in fragments. And beneath it all, a new Boston was forming. One less afraid of soap. One that had learned to laugh at its own wet past. You step into the light again, feeling the sun warm your face. It wasn't about French imports or fancy oils. Not really. It was about the right to rinse without fear. To feel your skin and not flinch. To know that a clean hand at night was not a sin, but a kindness. You find yourself walking alongside an older section of the town wall, its stone seams filled with creeping moss and time. The morning's hum is now a full murmur, voices, footsteps, hooves clattering on the cobblestones. But none of it touches you, not really. You're somewhere between now and then, carried by the scent of lavender oil and the echo of resistance so soft it barely called itself that. Because the further Boston walked away from its ban on nighttime bathing, the more those old rules transformed into something else, not laws, not threats, but stories. And stories, unlike ordinances, never truly die. One of the strangest, sweetest ripples of the ban's legacy lived on through Boston's children. Generations born long after the law had teeth still grew up hearing whispered warnings. Don't splash after supper, cleanliness sleeps when the bell tolls, or only the moon sees sinners with soap. These were nursery rhymes. Cautionary tales. Harmless on the surface, but loaded with history. You pass a small schoolhouse near the edge of town, a red-clapboard building with crooked shutters and a sagging stoop. In the 1780s, a teacher here named Rebecca Niles began collecting playground rhymes, fascinated by how children inherited fear like heirloom china. One of the verses she recorded went, "Scrub in the morning, scrub if it's light, but wash after sundown, and vanish from sight. Steam in the chimney, a knock at your door. The cleaners will catch you, and clean you no more." Spooky? Yes. But also revealing. These rhymes weren't about bathing anymore. They were about control, legacy, the slow, strange way a vanished law becomes bedtime poetry. Historians still argue whether these songs were invented by adults, or genuinely passed down by generations of kids playing near pumps and puddles. Probably both. You wander now past an alley thick with shadows, the kind that once concealed secret tubs, shared rags, and rebellious rinses. By the late 18th century, this neighborhood had changed hands, less Puritan, more merchant class, still strict but not humorless. And it's here you find something peculiar, a public fountain. Not grand. Just a spout carved into stone, with a rusted bowl below and a plaque barely legible through the grime. It reads, "For rest and refreshment. Kindly do not wash after 8. The plaque is a joke now, obviously. But it wasn't always. This was once a gathering place. And while no one ever posted guards here, the sign's presence did enough. It was a leftover whisper of enforcement, polite, absurd, almost charming in its uselessness. Still, it served a strange social purpose. The plaque let people pretend the rules still existed, even after no one obeyed it. Why? Because habits die harder than laws. And fear? That seeps into the cracks and stays. For years, there were still folks who wouldn't so much as wipe their face after sundown unless the blinds were closed and the bucket hidden. Not because they thought they'd be punished, but because their parents and grandparents had feared it. And that's enough. Trauma, it turns out, has a long shelf life. Especially when it's handed down with a rhyme. You keep walking, and now the town feels newer, brighter. Red brick replacing stone. Painted signs, papered windows. It's the early 1800s here, and the streets have names like Liberty and Joy. Ironic, considering how many laws still hung like cobwebs no one had bothered to clean. But one thing had changed completely by now, the water culture. Boston had entered its hydrotherapy era. A word you didn't expect, maybe? But it was real. Imported from Europe and championed by doctors, philosophers, and amateur wellness cranks alike. Water was now not only tolerated, it was medicine. Hydrotherapy manuals filled shelves. Newspapers featured tips on healthful dousing. One enthusiastic man wrote a 12-page essay on the virtues of cold foot bathing to stimulate the constitution. And no one, not a single soul, mentioned the old ban anymore. You pass a house built in 1805, its dooryard shaded by an enormous willow. The home belonged to a physician named Dr. Emery Coldwell, a man who wrote more about water than any Bostonian before or since. His personal motto? To soak is to live. He treated everything with water: sleeplessness, headaches, melancholy, marital discord. His solution? A rinse. Sometimes warm. Often cold. Always deeply invigorating. Patients swore by him. He became a bit of a local legend. Even the mayor reportedly visited for a restorative drip. Coldwell's wife, Margaret, ran a side business crafting scented bathing cloths, which were sold in tied bundles as night compressions for the overwrought. They came in flavors like basil mint, elderflower thyme, and the delightfully mysterious calm rain. Here, at last, bathing after sunset wasn't just allowed, it was prescribed. In 1812, a bathing house opened near the waterfront. Public, affordable, modest. It operated 7 days a week, from sunrise to well past twilight. Its founders? 2 widows and a former herbalist. The plaque out front reads, "For those who need a wash when the day grows long, may this house cleanse you gently, and without shame." That plaque still exists. It's now inside a museum. No one who visits it ever suspects that once, the city could have fined them for using water at the wrong hour. Because history is strange like that. You reach a bench now, quiet and cracked, with initials carved into its wood. A couple of dates. A single daisy. You smile, remembering the old stories of daisies left by the clean ones. Someone else remembered too. Maybe it's coincidence. Or maybe, like the songs, the whispers, the wink-wink soap labels, some memories don't fade. They settle in the corners. Hum through the cobblestones. Tickle your nose with rosemary when you least expect it. The children of Boston no longer feared the basin. They played in pumps, splashed in rain, soaked their feet on warm nights without a second thought. The ghost of the law still clung to nursery rhymes and fading signs, but it had no teeth. No steam watchers. No sermons. Just echoes. Sometimes funny. Sometimes beautiful. Always human. And if you lean back on this bench, close your eyes, and breathe in deep, you might catch a trace of lavender. Or lemon balm. Or simply the comfort of a city that finally forgave itself for once being afraid of soap after dark. And now, the shadows of the old law begin to take a different shape. Not fear. Not secrecy. But comedy. Yes, comedy. Because nothing dooms an old rule faster than becoming the punchline of a joke. And by the early 19th century, Boston had fully embraced its former bathing paranoia as one long, hilarious misunderstanding. Local theater troupes staged farcical plays with titles like The Sudsy Sinner and Moonlight and Mint Soap. One particularly popular production featured a magistrate who bursts into homes with a teapot instead of a lantern, mistakenly accusing residents of criminal steeping. Audiences laughed until they cried. You pass a print shop that once published a short-lived humor pamphlet called The Splash. It ran woodcut cartoons of people hiding tubs in closets, families running from soap bubbles like they were hornets, and one spectacular sketch of a reverend in a barrel, scrubbing his armpits while shouting, "I cleanse for the Lord." It was delightfully irreverent. And deeply cathartic. Because by laughing at the old rules, Boston was doing something radical. It was healing. Laws built on fear and control are like brittle masks. Once they're cracked, there's only one thing to do with them: hold them up, make a funny face, and let everyone see just how ridiculous they once looked. Even schoolchildren joined in. One 1817 school pageant featured a skit where students reenacted the Great Rinse of '03, a completely fictional event where townsfolk collectively rebelled by pouring buckets of water onto the mayor. It ended with a rousing song. We bathe, we wash with glee. We scrub our faces happily. No more the constable shall peer. We soap, we rinse, we show no fear. It was catchy. And not entirely off-key. In fact, some families kept singing it long after the performance ended, turning it into a bedtime song, complete with hand motions and a final giggle splash. You wander past a small general store whose dusty window displays brushes, old tin soap boxes, and a faded placard that reads, "Boston's cleanest, since 1793. It's hard to tell if it's proud or ironic. Probably both. Inside, the owner has pinned a clipping to the wall, a 19th century editorial from the Boston Almanac, reading, "We were once a city afraid of soap after sunset. Now we have lavender in our laundry and bathtubs with brass feet." Truly, time rinses all things. It became a popular saying. Time rinses all things. It was quoted in speeches, scribbled in letters, etched into fountain edges. It carried both a wink and a wisdom. An acknowledgement that what once terrified us can become the very thing we joke about while soaking our feet. But here's the twist. While most people chuckled and moved on, some began preserving the story. Not the law. Not the judgment. But the weirdness of it. The charm. By the 1830s, Boston had its first domestic curiosity society. A small group of amateur historians, herbalists, and delightfully nosy neighbors who collected anecdotes, artifacts, and oddities from colonial life. One of their early exhibits? A replica of a contraband night washing kit. It featured a linen basin, 2 herbs tied in a bundle, and a tiny pamphlet titled "To Wash Without Witness." The whole thing was displayed next to a sign that read, "Once illegal. Now just inconvenient." They even included a quote from an old magistrate's diary. "She bathed beneath the willow tree, in full defiance of the bell. I do confess, her ankles did shimmer." This drew a lot of knowing snickers. Eventually, museums followed suit. By the mid-19th century, several Boston cultural institutions included small sections on domestic prohibitions of early settlements. Nestled between displays on wool dyeing and butter churning, you'd find a quiet corner. There were early soap molds, period wash basins, reprints of the ordinance, even a watercolor painting titled "Moonlit Rinse," depicting a woman pouring water over her feet beside a brook, her expression serene and slightly mischievous. The painting became oddly famous. Prints were sold. It hung in drawing rooms. It was even turned into a popular embroidery pattern, stitched onto pillows by the daughters of the very sorts of families that once fined people for owning too much lavender. It was part nostalgia, part rebellion, and all transformation. Historians still argue whether this museumification was an attempt to atone or just a way to capitalize on weird history. But whatever the motive, it cemented the band's place, not as a terror, not as a rule, but as a relic. And the people embraced it. There were walking tours, parlor games, soap-scented candles labeled "Forbidden Splash." One soapmaker even rebranded his product as "Curfew Clean" with the tagline, "Perfect for when you don't care what the law says." It sold out in days. You cross a courtyard now paved in cobblestone and surrounded by ivy-covered brick buildings. A fountain bubbles gently at the center. Not a fancy one, just a worn cherub holding a bowl, moss on his feet, water trickling from a cracked jug. Beneath him, a plaque reads, "For those who dared to be clean too soon." It's playful, quietly defiant, beautiful in its own absurd way. You sit beside it, watching the water ripple and catch the light. You imagine all the people who once feared something as soft as soap, who whispered over basins, who clutched towels like secrets, who dried their hands before anyone could notice. And now? Children splash their fingers in this fountain. Couples dip kerchiefs. Joggers fill water bottles without a second thought. Because the law is gone. The shame is gone. But the story remains. And isn't that the strangest comfort of all? The idea that even the most ridiculous rules, those meant to control how you move, breathe, bathe, can become jokes. Can become songs. Can become warm ripples in a public square, gently nudging memory into something lighter. You look around one last time. The city moves on, as it always does. But somewhere, tucked inside an old window or folded in a museum drawer, someone still keeps a daisy. Just in case. Your feet carry you now toward one of Boston's older cemeteries, where crooked slate headstones lean like sleepy sentinels, and lichen creeps up through names half lost to weather and centuries of wind. The path crunches with dry leaves and pebbles, the morning light now thick with that midsummer golden hush, where everything feels softer, gentler. And even here, Among the graves, the story of Boston's great fear of after-supper soap continues to whisper. Because here, tucked along the far stone wall, is the modest grave of a woman named Mercy Alcott. The name almost too perfect, too on the nose. You'd think it fictional if not for the records. She lived from 1698 to 1762. And for decades she was known as the widow who washed. A minor legend. Mercy lost her husband young, left with 3 children and no fortune to speak of. She made her living laundering clothes, and according to neighbors, she never stopped working, even into the night. Candles flickered late in her windows, steam curling from her chimney, and laundry lines always heavy with linen long past curfew. The official tale goes like this: she was fined 6 times for violating the bathing ordinance. Not for washing herself, mind you, but for laundering after dusk, which often involved soaking arms, feet, and faces in water as part of the process. But that wasn't the scandal. Witnesses testified she began leaving her door open as she worked. Neighbors could see her pouring water, scrubbing, rinsing, bare arms glistening in candlelight. One local minister wrote furiously in his diary, "She acts as though steam were not sin. It rises from her windows like incense from a pagan altar." Mercy never replied to these accusations. At least, not in writing. But one year, on the anniversary of her husband's death, she reportedly placed a flower pot on her stoop containing a daisy, an unmistakable symbol of the clean ones. And that same week, a note was slipped beneath the church door, penned in a clear, assertive hand. "I will not rot for want of rinse." Historians still argue whether Mercy wrote it herself, or whether the community around her had begun to change. Perhaps both. You crouch near her grave now, the lettering faint but still legible. Mercy Alcott. Washer, widow, warm of spirit. Someone has left a bar of handmade soap beside the headstone. Wrapped in wax paper, twine tied in a perfect bow. The scent is faint, but unmistakable. Sage, mint, and something smoky, maybe birch. You smile. Because you realize now that Boston's after-dark bath ban didn't just fade, it was absorbed. Transformed. Remembered not through fear or law, but through people like Mercy. People who lived gently against the grain. You walk again. Your steps take you into a quieter street, one that wasn't there in the early years. This part of Boston was built later, after the Revolution, after the Great Fires, after the city began to stretch its arms and cast off its Puritan husk. Still, there's something old lingering here. A courtyard tucked behind a bakery. A window with blue glass panes. A back gate still hung with herbs. Here, a woman named Nora Bicknell ran what she called a house of seasonal remedies. It wasn't quite a shop. Not quite a clinic. But people came to her when they were weary, physically, emotionally, spiritually. She served broth, offered herbal teas, and most famously, kept a bathing closet. No bigger than a pantry. Just a copper tub, a pail, and a small bench. But it was always warm. Always ready. And it was always open after sunset. Nora never advertised. She didn't need to. People passed word quietly, across market stalls, beside fire pits, over church pews. It became known simply as the warm room. Widows went. Farmers. Pregnant women. Men with tired hands and sore feet. One sea captain reportedly walked half a mile every Thursday night just to soak his wrists in salt water and lavender. Nora's rules were simple. Clean up after yourself. Use only 1 scoop of soap. Leave a daisy in the window if you found peace there. The last rule confused people at first. But eventually that little sill above the warm room window filled with daisies, fresh, dried, painted, sewn. Each one a thank you from someone who had dared to be soft in a city still learning how. You reach the place now, though the warm room itself is long gone, replaced by a dull brick annex and a half-hearted mural. But a single iron hook still juts from the window frame. And hanging from it? A dried daisy, tied with twine. Someone remembers. Someone always does. Because even as Boston rushed toward modernity, paved roads, street lamps, plumbing, the story of the band stayed alive in these small, human places. In footnotes, In basins tucked behind curtains, children in schools now learn to wash daily. Employers start providing washing hours. Even soldiers are issued personal soap. And finally, after nearly 150 years, the old ordinance is quietly removed from the city's books. No fanfare. No announcement. Just a short line in a quarterly review of obsolete policies. The 1701 curfew on bathing is no longer applicable under current public health doctrine. That's it. A footnote. A flicker. Gone. But even in its erasure, it remains. Because history isn't kept alive by laws or dates. It's kept by people. By Widow Mercy and her daisy pot. By Nora and her warm room. By the children who splashed past curfew, the mothers who rinsed in moonlight, the lovers who bathed each other's feet after supper. By everyone who dared to be clean when the world demanded they stay dirty and obedient. You walk slower now. The day is beginning to stretch into afternoon. Sunlight dances on window panes, and somewhere, you swear you hear a lullaby, maybe one of those old, weird rhymes sung in jest but tinged with memory. Wash before the shadows creep. Or face a night of dirty sleep. But if your hands should touch the bowl, may kindness bathe your weary soul. It's silly. Sweet. Strange. Perfect, really? Because that's the legacy of this law, not fear, not shame. But persistence. Humor. Quiet resistance. And in its own strange way, love. The city begins to hum a little louder now, the kind of hum that comes not from noise but from layers of time pressed together like pages in an overstuffed book. And your feet know where to go, down into the folds of the city where stories linger like a trace of rosemary on old hands. You head toward the south end, where the houses grow statelier and the sidewalks stretch wider. The kind of neighborhood where gaslights once flickered through lace curtains, and no one wanted to admit they'd ever come from a town afraid of soap. Here, in the late 1800s, the story of Boston's bathing ban took on a new life, not as law, not as legacy, but as entertainment. That's right. The old ordinance had become folklore, and folklore, as always, made its way into parlor games. You pause outside an old townhouse now turned into apartments. In the 1880s, this building belonged to a socialite named Eliza Pembroke, who hosted what were affectionately called history teas. Each month, guests would gather in starched collars and corseted gowns to sip chamomile, nibble lemon biscuits, and perform dramatic reenactments of strange Boston laws from centuries past. And you better believe the sunset bathing ban was a favorite. Eliza herself played Madam Midnight, a fictionalized mashup of various rebellious women who supposedly bathed in secret. Guests took turns playing the constable, neighbors, or church elders. There were props, little tin tubs, soaps made of painted wood, even a velvet rope meant to symbolize the curfew bell. Laughter filled the room as characters were arrested for dabbing their faces, or for possessing a dangerous towel. One sketch even included a parody trial with charges like unlawful soaking with intent to soften. Ridiculous? Entirely. But also healing. Because in performing the absurd lost its grip. You imagine those tea-sipping women in silk and brooches, giggling as they hid toy washcloths in their skirts. Grown adults, reclaiming a history that once ruled with shame, now holding it up to the light and saying, "Really? This was what we were scared of." It didn't stop with parties. The ban found its way into magazines, children's books, even satirical poetry. One popular piece from 1891 titled "To Wash or..." And so, the law that once crept into bedrooms and made people hide their towels had now become a punchline. A decorative accent. You stroll through a quiet little park now, unassuming, shaded, mostly used by dog walkers and daydreamers. But beneath this lawn lies the foundation of what was once Boston's first fully municipal bathhouse, established in 1895. It was built not because people finally decided baths were fine, but because public health demanded it. You see, by the end of the 19th century, Boston's population had boomed. Immigrants poured into the city, Irish, Italian, Polish, and more. Many lived in tenements with no plumbing, no tubs, no space. Disease spread. And suddenly, cleanliness wasn't just fashionable, it was essential. The city that once punished nighttime soap now handed it out in bars by the crate. Bathhouses became symbols of civic pride. The mayor attended their ribbon cuttings. Photos were printed in newspapers showing rows of clawfoot tubs gleaming like altars. But here's the thing, even as the city moved forward, it never quite forgot its past. One reporter, writing for the Boston Daily Advertiser in 1896, penned this gem while covering the opening of the new South End facility. Let the ghosts of old constables weep. For tonight, Boston bathes, and we bathe proud. You grinned just reading it. Because by then, everyone knew. The law was ancient history. But its memory still glimmered at the edges of culture like a half-winked star. Children were taught the story in school, not as a cautionary tale, but as a moral about how absurd fear can become if left unchecked. Teachers would write on chalkboards, 1701 bathing after sunset was forbidden, and then let the class react, as they always did, groans, giggles, wide-eyed disbelief. One former student wrote in a diary that her teacher even acted out the part of the town crier yelling, "Down with steam," while dramatically waving a ladle. Field trips took students to old wash houses, where guides would whisper, "And here is where the women secretly rinsed their hair beneath the moonlight." It was said half spooky, half romantic, like a bedtime story with just enough scandal to thrill. And sometimes, the students responded with their own creations. A class at the girls' high school staged a performance titled The Soap Rebellion, complete with a curtain drop where students in period costumes threw flower petals shaped like suds into the air. It received rave reviews in the school newsletter. A boy named Peter wrote a short story where the ghost of a woman who bathed after dark haunted Boston City Hall, not to scare, but to make sure the plumbing never broke again. It won him a prize. These small things mattered, because they weren't just laughing at the past, they were tending to it. Like an old garden. Pulling up the weeds, leaving the odd daisy, letting the sunshine in. You keep walking. Past churches with softened sermons. Past houses with modern bathrooms and citronella candles. Past museums with plaques that mention, with a wink, the old law that once made steam suspect. You pass a little shop window where bath oils glisten behind glass, lavender, eucalyptus, cedarwood. A small handwritten sign beneath them reads, "Evening soaks encouraged." You nod. Of course they are. And in that moment you realize something beautiful. Boston didn't just forget the ban. It absorbed it. Transmuted it. What was once fear became performance. What was shame became art. What was secrecy became shared ritual. The law had been composted into culture. You reach for the door to a cafe now, pausing just as a gust of wind flutters a faded sticker on the glass. It's round. Pale blue. A silhouette of a tub under a crescent moon. And the words? Proud to bathe after dusk since Boston, once haunted by the sound of dripping water in darkened kitchens, now chuckles every time someone turns on a tap at 9 p.m. You step inside. Steam rises from mugs. The scent of mint tea fills the air. People talk softly, laugh gently, lean in close. Clean. And entirely unafraid. There's something different about the way you walk now. Not faster, not slower, just smoother. Like the cobblestones remember you. Like the ghosts of steam, soap, and civic overreaction have nodded their approval, letting you pass into the next part of the story. And this part? This part's about Martha Toothel. Oh yes, that Martha. If you've heard only one name associated with the old band besides some angry church guy, it's probably hers. Her tale, equal parts tragedy, comedy, and mild mischief, has become a favorite for retellings in history books, plays, and even a children's cartoon once, although that version left out the bucket-throwing incident. Let's go back. It's 1749. Summer. You can feel the heat already, a Boston kind of heat that sticks to your hairline and makes every waistcoat a form of punishment. The wells are warm. The nights are worse. And Martha Toothel, widow, midwife, and known moon gardener, is not interested in obeying the sunset bathing ban. She's also not subtle about it. Her home was small, at the edge of town, near what's now a cluster of overpriced condos. But back then, it was the marshy, quiet fringe where folks planted herbs, gathered water, and, in Martha's case, built a little bathing shed out back. Let's be clear, she didn't try to hide it. Neighbors claimed they saw lanterns glowing from the windows of the shed late at night, steam drifting like clouds from the thatched roof. Some said she sang as she washed. One overly dramatic woman insisted she wore flowers in her hair while doing it. When confronted, Martha didn't deny it. She famously told the local constable, "I do not ask the knight's permission to be clean." It's not surprising she ended up in court. What is surprising is the absurdity of the charges. The 1749 indictment against her included unauthorized post-sunset ablution, disturbing the quietude with domestic splashing, harboring scents unknown and foreign, tempting younger women into improper refreshment. Oh yes, that last one? A neighbor's teenage daughter had been seen exiting Martha's property with wet hair and a suspiciously lemony aroma. Martha, it seemed, had begun offering her bathing shed to others. She'd created Boston's first unofficial nighttime spa. The courtroom was packed. Townsfolk gathered like it was theater. Accounts from the day describe people bringing fruit, fanning themselves, whispering bets about whether Martha would cry or curse. She did neither. She stood calmly, wearing a plain gray dress and a slight smile. When asked why she defied the ordinance, she replied, "Because I am tired. Because my feet ache. Because a woman who wipes the sweat from her brow should not then sleep in it." The gallery murmured. Someone even clapped. Historians still argue whether this trial marked the turning point of public sentiment. But there's little doubt it left an impression. The judge, awkwardly dabbing his forehead, sentenced her to 2 days in the town holding room, technically a basement with a cot, and issued a warning that further infractions would result in penitence by cold soak. Martha reportedly replied, "I've soaked colder." She became a folk hero overnight. Pamphlets circulated retelling her testimony. One popular broadside titled "The Bravest Bucket" included a woodcut of Martha pouring water onto her feet, surrounded by scandalized neighbors. Of course, the legend got wilder with each retelling. Some said she smuggled in imported French soap and wore a crown of rosemary. Others claimed she lured townswomen into late-night cleansing circles where they sang ancient bathing songs passed down from herbalist grandmothers. There is zero historical evidence for these things. But that didn't stop people from believing them. In truth, Martha returned home quietly. She tended her garden. She continued her work as a midwife. And yes, she likely continued to bathe at night, just a bit more discreetly. She died in 1763, at age 67. Her burial record notes her as Martha Toothill, widow, herbalist, well known to the court. That last line? Almost certainly a joke. Maybe even self-submitted. But she left behind more than just court transcripts and gossip. In her will, she donated the bathing shed to her friend Tabitha Green, along with written instructions on maintaining it, a small herbal guide, and this note. If the world still fears water when you read this, remind it that it too came from the womb, and there, we all begin wet. Tabitha kept it running. Quietly. Privately. The shed lasted another 15 years before being dismantled during a property dispute, but by then, its influence had already rippled across town. Women named their daughters Martha in her honor. Some painted daisies on the backs of washbasins. And one local playwright staged The Woman Who Washed at Dusk, a tragicomedy in 3 acts, starring a barely disguised version of Martha, who defeats a tyrannical judge using only soap bubbles and confident posture. By the 1800s, schoolchildren had shortened the tale to Martha the Moonbather, making her the heroine of more than a few classroom skits. One story even claimed her ghost still haunts Boston, not with wails or moans, but with the scent of rosemary mint soap curling through alleyways on humid nights. You pause near a street sign now, one that reads Toothill Lane. Small. Easy to miss. But it's there. The city doesn't advertise its oddest history. It lets you stumble into it. And standing there, With warm bricks behind you and the afternoon sun streaking between chimney shadows, you understand what Martha's story really meant. She wasn't a revolutionary. She wasn't trying to make a point. She was just tired. She wanted to soak her feet, rinse her skin, and maybe, just maybe, go to bed feeling more like herself than a set of rules would allow. And that's what scared them. That's what scared all of them. Because nothing is more terrifying to a system built on obedience than a person who chooses comfort over compliance. Martha didn't storm City Hall. She didn't write pamphlets. She just filled a bucket and said, no. And in doing so, she said yes to herself, to her neighbors, to every tired woman who looked at the curfew bell and thought, that can't be right. She bathed. She shared. She dared to smell like citrus after 8. And the city never quite got over it. You follow the faint curve of Toothhill Lane until it folds quietly into a residential street. Wider, cleaner, the kind of place where roses climb fence posts and children chalk hopscotch squares without understanding they're dancing over centuries of story. The air here has a kind of stillness to it, but underneath, you can almost hear the echo of water being poured, a candle flickering in a curtained room, and someone humming as they dip their feet into a basin. Because even as Boston modernized, bricks giving way to brownstones, chimneys to gas lamps, the tale of the band never entirely dried up. It didn't haunt the city. It steeped in it, soaking its way into ordinary moments in the most unexpected places. One of those places? Boston's libraries. Not the grand ones with domes and marble lions, though they've certainly got their share of archived bathing lore, but the little ones. The parish reading rooms. The private collections. The tea-stained corners of borrowed books. In the early 20th century, a curious librarian named Edwin Lockwood began cataloging social artifacts of forgotten ordinances. A fancy way of saying, weird stuff people used to get in trouble. Lockwood was fascinated by how a law could once be so feared, and later, so fondly ridiculed. He compiled newspaper clippings, satire, trial transcripts, school skits, and even overheard playground rhymes into what he called the soap files. You pause in front of what used to be his home, a squat wooden building now converted into a coffee shop that smells like cardamom and old books. He lived alone with 3 cats, reportedly bathed twice a day, with no shame, and made it his mission to ensure people didn't forget just how strange and human this little corner of history really was. His most famous pamphlet, circulated in 1910, was titled, Let the People Bathe, A Brief History of Boston's Evening Cleanliness Crisis, and Why It Makes Us Funnier Than New York. It sold modestly. But it hit just the right nerve, ironic, warm, and weirdly patriotic. A gentle reminder that even uptight Boston had its soggy, sudsy skeletons. You step inside the cafe now. The floor creaks softly under your feet. Over by the counter, a small bookshelf stands next to the pastry display. It's filled with donated tomes, recipe cards, and, wedged between a cookbook and a gardening guide, a reprint of Lockwood's soap files. You flip it open. Inside, a drawing of the curfew bell, a hand-sketched daisy, and a quote from an anonymous 1761 housewife. They cannot find me for thoughts, so I will think of soap. You grin? Because by now, you understand exactly what that meant. It wasn't about rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was about dignity. About imagining comfort, even when you couldn't reach for it just yet. Edwin Lockwood died in 1932. His cats outlived him. His pamphlets didn't become bestsellers, but they survived. Tucked into attic boxes, donated to archives, passed along by teachers who thought history should include a laugh now and then. And through him, the Bath Band continued to shimmer on the edges of Boston's memory. Not with outrage. Not even with apology. But with affection. Because something strange had begun to happen. As Boston entered the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, and then the post-war boom, its citizens started using the story of the band in a whole new way, as a kind of icebreaker. A quirky, endearing thing to share with tourists, pen pals, or dinner guests. Oh, did you know our city used to fine people for bathing after dark? It became the city's favorite party trick. Tour guides through it in between stops. Grandparents told it to bored grandchildren. Journalists cited it in columns about outdated laws, always followed by a snort of disbelief and a comforting reminder that we've come a long way. One popular travel guide from the 1950s had an entire section titled, "Boston, come for the Freedom Trail, stay for the former bathing anxiety." It included a cartoon of a Puritan woman holding a sponge and looking suspiciously over her shoulder. The caption? "Suds and Sinners." By the 1960s, local novelty shops sold bumper stickers that read, "I bathe after sunset, Boston born and scrubbed." Tacky? Absolutely. But also endearing. Because Boston had finally achieved what few cities managed to do. It had turned its own shame into charm. You head back outside now, the breeze catching your sleeve as church bells toll the hour. The city is alive in that casual way it has, its people weaving stories into their days like steam into evening air. And here's something delightful. Even as the law became legend, its symbols stuck around. The daisy, once a secret badge of the clean ones, made its way into everything from embroidery samplers to diner logos. A few local bakeries even sold midnight daisy cookies, simple shortbread rounds. One old neighborhood even rebranded its annual block party as the Soapy Sunday Social. You could buy commemorative towels, enter the daisy decorating contest, or listen to dramatic readings of historic trial transcripts. One year, someone brought a goat and tried to stage a symbolic washing rebellion. It was chaos. It was glorious. Meanwhile, schools began to get more playful in their history lessons. Teachers dressed in black robes, pretending to read charges aloud while students giggled through mock defenses like, "I only meant to wash my feet, sir. The rest of me remains gloriously grimy." Or, "If it pleased the court, the moon had not fully risen." And then, of course, came the t-shirts. The mugs. The commemorative soaps carved with the phrase, "May your water be warm and your curfews unenforced." Ridiculous? Sure. But so deeply human. Because that's the thing about stories like this. They start as fear. They evolve into resistance. They settle into memory. And if we're lucky, they grow soft and funny and warm, like steam rising off a basin at the end of a long day. You take one more turn, finding yourself back at the edge of Beacon Hill. A lamppost stands tall here, just beside a low wall with ivy crawling up its spine. And at its base? A brass plaque, modest and quiet. It reads, "In memory of those who rinsed after dusk, and helped wash away the fear." Below it, someone has left a daisy. Fresh. You linger at the base of the lamppost, your eyes drawn again to the fresh daisy placed beneath the plaque. Its yellow center is bright, a quiet sun against the cobblestones, and you can't help but think of all the hands that have left similar offerings over the years. Gentle, fragrant nods to stories passed through generations, folded into lives, not shouted but whispered. Boston may not speak about its former ban on bathing after dark with shame anymore, but neither does it shout its history from the rooftops. Instead, it's tucked in, layered under brick and memory, like an old quilt. And nowhere is that layering more visible than in Boston's architecture. You begin to wander again, this time past brownstones and storefronts, along streets that loop and double back like thought trails. Here, history isn't just preserved, it's lived in. A curious thing happens when a law dies but its ghost lingers. The shapes it left behind remain visible, even when the meaning is long gone. Take the peculiar placement of certain windows. Walk past homes built in the mid-1700s and you'll notice that some have small side windows near the back, high up, always just above ground level. For decades, architectural historians debated their purpose. Were they for light? Air circulation? But one theory, now gaining more acceptance, is this: they were steam windows. Designed not to let light in, but to let heat out. Placed discreetly so that the evidence of evening baths wouldn't accumulate and betray residents to nosy neighbors or Puritan constables sniffing out moral decay through moisture. Historians still argue whether this was intentional stealth design or simply a coincidental quirk. But you notice the pattern, and once you do, it's everywhere. It makes sense. If you can't stop washing, you redesign the world to make it less noticeable. It's a pattern older than laws themselves. You pause at a home with one such window, set just above a well-worn stair. The bricks are soot-stained. The sash is painted shut. But you imagine the families who once slipped water across their skin by candlelight, then flung that sash wide to send their sins and steam skyward. It's funny, isn't it? How something like water vapor once had the power to incriminate. And yet, out of all this anxiety came innovation. For example, the birth of the day basin. By the late 1700s, Boston shops began marketing shallow, decorative water basins designed to be used only in the early hours. Some were porcelain. Others made of polished tin. A few were fitted with built-in clocks. Yes, clocks. That chimed softly when it was nearing curfew, as a reminder to finish rinsing. You pass an antique shop now, its dusty window packed with lace gloves and forgotten phonographs. And there, tucked behind a row of pewter candlesticks, is a basin with a tiny brass dial and faint painted flowers on the rim. A small card below it reads, "Curfew Basin, circa 1780, no water after dark." You lean closer and spot a daisy carved faintly along the edge. They were everywhere, those daisies. Like breadcrumbs. Little signals tucked into the corners of washcloths and bath tiles, pressed into soap molds, even carved onto furniture. One of the earliest surviving rocking chairs from the era has a daisy carved beneath the seat, possibly by a rebellious mother who wanted to remind herself, as she bathed her baby in secret, that she was not alone. Even today, when Boston renovates an older home, it's not uncommon to find a daisy scratched faintly into a beam, hidden behind plaster. Sometimes alone. Sometimes in clusters. Like petals never fully swept away. You step out of the shadow of the shop, into the sun, and continue along the street until it opens into a tidy garden square. Here, the flower beds are precise. There's a wrought iron fence and benches arranged like polite sentences. But what draws your attention is the small stone fountain in the center. It isn't elaborate. Just a simple dish-shaped basin with water pouring from a copper spout shaped like a daisy. The base is engraved with words in delicate script. Wash freely, when your soul is weary. Locals call this place Mercy's Circle. It's not on most maps. There's no statue of Martha Toothill here, no monument to the bathhouse widows or the clean ones. But this space is theirs in spirit. A patch of calm in the bustle. A small rebellion that's long since been absorbed into peace. Some days, the fountain's water smells faintly of mint. No one quite knows why. Maybe the city added something to the pipes. Maybe someone tosses in herbs. Or maybe, and this is what the elderly woman feeding birds on the bench will tell you if you ask nicely, it's the scent of memory itself, rising up like warm steam. It's easy to scoff at such things. But then again, this entire tale has taught you something, hasn't it? That the most ridiculous laws can reveal the deepest truths. That small defiance, repeated with gentleness and persistence, becomes tradition. That shame doesn't stand a chance against humor and lavender. And that maybe, just maybe, scent can carry stories when words grow tired. As you rest on the edge of the fountain, the breeze shifts. A little girl skips past with her father, clutching a string of daisies. She stops, tosses one into the water, and grins. "It's for the foot-washing lady," she says. The father chuckles. "Martha Toothpick?" "Toothill," she corrects, very serious. He lifts his brows. "Oh, you learned about her in school?" She nods proudly. She was the first person to wash on purpose. That may not be exactly historically accurate, but it's not wrong either. Because what mattered most wasn't the law, or even the defiance, it was the choice. To scrub. To rinse. To feel clean and good and safe even when the world told you not to. The little girl runs off, her daisy trail fluttering behind her like a flag. You stand again, feeling the warmth of sun and story on your back, and walk on. Because this tale isn't ending, it's settling. Like soap scum in a basin, like steam on glass, like a daisy press, the city has softened. But it remembers. And so do you. You move again, drawn now toward the harbor. The air sharpens a little, cooler, brinier, with the scent of salt riding in on the wind like an old sailor with too many stories and just enough time. The cobblestones smoothed into boardwalks, the chatter of gulls layering over the hush of waves and the occasional clang of boat rigging. It's easy to think of Boston only in terms of land, church bells, marketplaces, shadowy alleys where soap once dared not slosh. But the harbor? The harbor saw everything. In fact, the harbor may have been the only place where the bathing ban never fully reached. Because once you were out on the water, beyond the edge of curfew bells and wooden fences, the city's grip loosened just enough for people to breathe. And occasionally, to bathe. By the mid-1700s, Boston's maritime communities were already experimenting with floating tubs. Barrels cut and weighted so they'd sit just low enough in the water to serve as impromptu baths, tethered discreetly to docks under moonlight. It sounds ridiculous. It was ridiculous. But also genius. Sailors returning from weeks at sea used them. Wives whose homes had no privacy. Laborers too exhausted to walk inland. One dockhand named Lem Callister reportedly turned his entire rowboat into a mobile bathhouse. For a few pennies, you could climb aboard, soak in a copper basin warmed over coals, and enjoy a breeze that smelled only faintly of fish and freedom. The city, naturally, objected. They posted signs at various piers. No washing after dusk / this means waterfront too. But enforcement was slippery. For one, most harbor baths occurred in the dark, and chasing naked bathers down a foggy dock was not something even the most ambitious constables wanted to write in their logs. And two, the sea had its own authority. Tide and time don't bow to city laws. Historians still argue whether the harbor operated as a kind of legal gray zone during the ban years. Was it technically city jurisdiction? Or did maritime customs override local ordinances once you crossed the salt line? Records are muddy. Quite literally. But journals from the time paint a clear picture. The harbor was a haven. One merchant wrote of seeing 3 women beneath the wharf, seated in planks of water as though they dined on cleanliness, and marveled that no one interrupted them. A French sailor described Le Bain de Nuit as a Boston secret better kept than its gunpowder. It wasn't just functional. It was beautiful. You imagine it now, candles in glass jars bobbing gently near the waterline. Quiet splashes echoing against hulls. The moon dancing over waves as someone dipped their elbows, their face, their fears. There's even a painting, tucked in the archives of a forgotten gallery, that shows a woman seated in a floating barrel, steam curling upward, daisy tucked behind one ear, her eyes closed. The title? Freedom Bath. And slowly, that's what the waterfront became known for. Freedom. A kind of defiant cleansing no ordinance could fully touch. It's not surprising that, once the ban was lifted, this spirit didn't fade, it flourished. Public bathing piers sprang up throughout the harbor. Floating bathhouses with curtained stalls and full tubs became staples of summer. One was even christened the Midnight Daisy, an obvious nod to the hidden history that birthed it. Families gathered at twilight, unfazed by former curfews. Children splashed openly where once feet were dipped in secret. Teenagers dared each other to cannonball from the gangway with squeals that echoed off schooners. And the elders? They smiled. Quietly. Knowing. You pass a plaque now near an old wharf. It's shaped like a paddle and reads. Here, in the hush, even after the ban ended, some insisted that modesty should still win out. One famous reverend argued that bathing outdoors, even legally, was a slippery slope to sin, skin, and societal decay. But the people had already moved on. In fact, the first city-sponsored moonlight swim event occurred in 1914. Billed as the harbor hygienic, it welcomed over 200 participants. They wore modest swimsuits, lined up for towel tokens, and were greeted by a small brass band playing a waltz titled the Tub Waltz. The event was a hit. They brought it back yearly. Each time, someone placed daisies at the end of the dock. You reach that very spot now. It's just wood and rope, nothing fancy. The water laps gently, dark and deep, the wind wrapping around your shoulders like a warm blanket. It's here that you realize, the harbor never judged. It simply held. held the cold feet of those sneaking out with basins, held the embarrassed hands rinsing calluses and shame, held the sighs of people who wanted to go to bed clean. And in a city once obsessed with when you bathed, the sea offered a single, salty shrug, whenever you need. You dip your fingers in now. It's cool, bracing, but kind. And you wonder if somewhere, long ago, Martha Toothel stood right here, maybe on a dare, maybe out of desperation, and dipped her hand in too. Felt the same chill, the same defiance, the same tenderness. Because in the end, that's what Boston's band left behind, not a legacy of control, but a mosaic of tiny freedoms. A flower carved into a basin, a window cracked just wide enough, a harbor full of secret steam and laughing sailors. The law is gone. The shame is gone. But the water remains. And tonight, if you listen closely, as the tide brushes the pilings and the last rays of sun catch on the waves, you might hear a voice whispering from the deep. Go on. Wash your face. The city won't mind anymore. You leave the harbor behind, trailing your fingers along a salt-worn railing as you return to the heart of the city. The streets feel quieter now, slower somehow, as if Boston herself is catching her breath, brushing the soap suds from her shoulders after a centuries-long rinse. What began as a tale of fear and ordnance has softened into a lullaby of memory, and you're beginning to feel it, how the past cradles the present, how the oddest rules leave the most lingering warmth. Your path leads you toward the Boston Athenaeum, a place where dust doesn't mean decay, it means reverence. Shelves tower. Sunlight cuts through tall windows and golden shafts. Somewhere between the hush and the hardwood, a librarian hums to herself. This is where the law first hit after it died. When the ordinance was repealed in the 1800s, it wasn't publicly burned or ceremoniously torn up. It was quietly shelved, folded into the city archives. Pages yellowing, ink fading, but preserved like all the other strange fragments of Boston's old bones. And here, among the law books and maritime charts, lies the original pamphlet titled, On the Matter of Moisture, an Ordinance Concerning Evening Cleansing, 1701. It's bound in leather, brittle at the corners, its seal still intact. And yes, it includes that fateful line, no citizen shall engage in personal ablution by basin, tub, or cloth from dusk until sunrise. Someone, long ago, has underlined that sentence. Next to it, in a margin written in delicate, deliberate script, are the words, Good luck enforcing that, Jonathan. You'd like to think Martha Toothel wrote that. Or Mercy Alcott. Or one of their friends with calloused hands and no more patience for foolishness. The Athenaeum has preserved more than just books. There's a box in the corner marked Bathing Culture, New England, full of scraps most historians would dismiss, an embroidered towel stitched with daisy. All characters freeze dramatically as the curfew bell tolls. A single bar of soap rolls across the stage. You laugh softly. Because it's perfect. And just beyond the box lies a curious letter, unsigned, undated, addressed only to whom it may comfort. It reads, I bathe now as I please. My children ask no permission to be clean. And yet I hold no bitterness for what once was. Only gratitude, strange as it seems. For the night I first rinsed my face by candlelight, heart pounding, skin warm, steam curling against the shutters, that night I felt most alive. You pause there. Let it sink in. Because that's the true legacy, not the law, but the moment someone chose to ignore it. The breathe between fear and defiance. The scent of mint soap in a too-still house. You exit the library, stepping into the evening air. The city is shifting toward dusk again. Lamps flicker on. Somewhere, dinner dishes are being rinsed. And behind a cracked window, someone draws a bath without a second thought. It's a kind of magic, isn't it? Not fire and lightning, but warm water and agency. You follow the gaslight glow down Mount Vernon Street, where a few houses display discreet metal plaques in their windows, tiny daisy emblems. Some say it's just a nod to local history. Others insist it marks homes that once held secret basins, back in the bad old days. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. That's where most truths live, after all. You duck into a small alley, almost hidden by overgrown ivy and a leaning mailbox. It opens into a courtyard, circular and quiet, where the stones are arranged not randomly but carefully, like petals around a center. In the middle sits a fountain. Low, round, unassuming. It doesn't gurgle or spray. It simply seeps, a slow, steady trickle of water down a smooth stone bowl. No fanfare. No signage. Just peace. Locals call it the basin. Some say it's fed by the same spring that once ran beneath the homes of the clean ones. Others claim it's symbolic, a deliberate reconstruction meant to honor their spirit. No one seems to know who built it, or when. But every evening, just before sunset, someone leaves a fresh daisy on its edge. Always just one. Never more. You sit beside it now, letting the sound of the water settle behind your ribs. A pair of pigeons flutters nearby. One pecks at the edge of the basin. The other waddles through a patch of clover. Time stretches. Breath slows. And you realize how little it takes to soften a city. One basin. One flower. One act of defiance done kindly. Boston has bathed away her fear, laughed away her shame, and dried herself with stories stitched from every secret washcloth, every outlawed rinse, every whispered bedtime rhyme. In fact, somewhere nearby, a parent is probably reading from one of those children's books now, the ones with bright drawings of steam and soap and stern-faced constables who never quite catch the heroine. And maybe, just before lights out, they'll whisper, "Remember, you can always wash, even when the world says not to." You rise from the bench, stretch your legs, and glance back, the spot where the original ordinance was debated, signed, and implemented with the grim solemnity that only a council of Puritan magistrates could summon for something as mundane as evening bathing. The original meeting house is long gone, of course. In its place now? A modest little courtyard beside a government annex. The building has beige bricks and flickering fluorescent lights, thoroughly uninspiring. But the courtyard? That's something else. There's a small round garden at its center, just 6 feet across. Nothing but a few herbs, mint, chamomile, lemon balm, planted in neat rings. A weathered sign nearby reads, "In memory of the ordinances we outgrew." No dates. No names. Just a quiet acknowledgement that even laws can be temporary, and sometimes a little ridiculous. You step closer. Between the plants, nestled gently in the soil, are pebbles etched with phrases. Clean and kind. Feet before sleep. Steam is not a sin. Someone tends to this place. Not officially. Not with city funding. But faithfully. A few locals call it the Garden of Quiet Rebellion. You can see why. Because this is the final chapter, isn't it? Not just of the story, but of the transformation. From shame to satire. From punishment to pride. From fear of water, to leaving a daisy beside a public fountain just because someone once told you not to. It's hard to believe now that a city so known for revolution once trembled at the idea of rinsing past sundown. That somewhere, centuries ago, a tired woman looked at a curfew bell and a full basin and thought, no. No to grit. No to discomfort. No to letting fear set the rules in her own home. And that single no echoed for centuries. Because once someone says it, others follow. Quietly at first. Then boldly. Then joyfully. You imagine all the people who followed, the midwives, the laundresses, the harbor bathers, the hidden soap makers, the children who played splash games after supper, the teachers who turned daisy sketch chalkboards into battlegrounds for dignity. You picture Edwin Lockwood typing by candlelight, his cats purring as he documented absurd ordinances and their unexpected cultural aftershocks. You remember Nora's warm room, Mercy's daisy pot, Martha Toothill's bathtub of quiet defiance. And you realize something vital. They didn't need to be loud. They just needed to keep washing. Keep rinsing. Keep choosing small comforts even when called improper. It wasn't grand rebellion. It was something better, persistence. Even now you feel it. This strange pride in a city that made a rule, and then, ever so gently, let it wash away. Not with fire or protest, but with mint soap and bedtime lullabies. You sit on the garden bench, the scent of lemon balm rising faintly as the light dims. From the far side of the street, someone appears, an older woman in a windbreaker and sneakers, carrying a basket filled with something wrapped in cloth. She pauses beside the garden, stoops, and gently unrolls the fabric. A single daisy. She nestles it into the soil, just between the mint and the stone that reads steam is not a sin. Then she smiles. Not at you. Not at anyone in particular. Just to the air, as if the city has said thank you. She walks on. And you stay a little longer. Because this isn't just the end of a lull. It's the start of a new kind of memory. One carried not in textbooks, but in gestures. A basin filled without shame. A teacher reading Martha and the Moon Bath to second graders on a rainy Tuesday. A bakery selling lemon verbena soap bars stamped with the phrase "Go ahead, soak." A tiny daisy, pinned to a lapel or carved into a window frame. All of it saying, quietly and clearly, "We remember. We changed. We are clean, and still here." And in a world that keeps inventing new rules to fear softness, that might be the most powerful legacy of all. So tonight, when you run the tap or light a candle beside your own tub, think of them. The clean ones? The quiet rebels. The women who bathed by moonlight. The boys who giggled as they snuck a rinse. The elders who smiled as shame was finally rinsed away. You're part of their story now. No curfew bell will toll. No fine will follow. No preacher will scowl from the shadows. Just warm water, a little soap, and the soft knowledge that being gentle with yourself has always been the bravest kind of protest. So now, as the city settles and your breath grows slower, let the story begin to dissolve like steam on a mirror. The streets of Boston stretch behind you now, softened under the hush of dusk and memory. The flicker of lamps, the creak of old wood, the scent of chamomile or maybe mint, each one a whisper from the past saying, "You're safe now." You no longer need to hide your comfort. No need to glance over your shoulder before dipping your toes into a basin. No need to count the hours or worry if the sun has slipped too far. All those rules, all that shame, all those old papers with ridiculous ink, they've faded like fog burned away by morning. In their place? A daisy. A laugh. A city that learned to let go. So go ahead. Stretch. Sink. Breathe deeper. Picture warm water curling around your shoulders, all tension melting into the quiet. Nothing expected of you. Nothing withheld. Just peace. Your feet are clean. Your hands are soft. Your story, however sleepy, is your own now. And whatever strange rules tomorrow might bring, remember, there's always a basin waiting, a daisy blooming, and a bit of gentle rebellion in choosing rest. Good night. Sleep well. You're home.